She was an it girl in the Golden State.
She had a certain spunk, a certain it factor, and everybody wanted to be with her or around her.
The men loved her. I mean, loved her.
Even though she clearly had a lot of admirers, you know, she was really trying to do it by herself and be really independent.
But when blood-curdling screams ring out, she's at risk of losing it all.
Mika!
He frantically started banging on her door, calling her name. We were panicked. We thought maybe there had been a kidnapping as well.
As detectives investigate, they unravel a story of obsession and betrayal.
He had a crush on her. He was infatuated with her.
Maybe he could not deal with the rejection and finally snapped.
She breaks down and admits, yes, it upset me that my husband went out with this woman.
She told him that tonight she was going to die.
Will the killer evade justice?
Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years.
We were not getting any answers, trying to figure out what had happened.
Or was the real culprit hiding in plain sight?
When he said that to me, the hair on my neck stood up.
The text comes back positive for deception.
I felt like at that moment that I could have been looking at a killer.
January 1999. It's the start of a new year in Richmond, California.
Richmond is an inner city that is located approximately 30 minutes from San Francisco and 20 minutes from Oakland.
Richmond was a working class city with individuals that were trying to make a way for themselves and their families.
The majority of the population of Richmond were good families, good people.
But the Richmond community is also struggling with a growing crime problem.
In the 1990s, for a city that was relatively small, it was plagued by crime.
It was still suffering from the crack epidemic.
It was not uncommon to have multiple homicides on any given day.
On the morning of January 9th, one local resident, Andrew Piper, is still asleep after a relatively quiet night, until he's jolted awake by the sound of screaming.
He was sleeping on his couch, and he was awakened by blood-curdling screams from his neighbor's apartment across a shared driveway.
He knows that a young mother named Mika Wadley lives there with her 18-month-old baby.
He's afraid for their safety, so he quickly ran over there to check on them and see what's going on.
He frantically started banging on Mika's door, calling her name.
Mika!
The neighbor attempts to open the door, but it's locked.
He's continuing to hear the screams for about 30 more seconds, and then it goes silent inside.
Mika, can you hear me? Hello?
He knew that Mika was in trouble, so he returns to his own apartment, he retrieves his phone, and makes the call to 911.
I'm really concerned about my neighbor.
26-year-old Mika Wadley was beautiful inside and out.
She was real sweet, kind-hearted, easy to get along with. She was very lovable. She made you smile. She made you feel good about yourself.
She was so outgoing. She had so many friends. It was just her personality. She had a very nice personality. She got along with everybody.
She just loved being around people. She was a very people person.
But in addition to her outgoing personality, Mika also had a fiery side.
She was a little feisty. People just didn't play with her. If they did challenge her, she would be up for the challenge.
Nobody messed with her. She could back her stuff up very good.
I think you should bet more than that.
You want me to bet more?
More than that.
Mika had a certain spunk, a certain it factor, and everybody wanted to be with her or around her.
The men loved her. I mean, loved her. They were just attracted to her. Her personality, her funness.
She was known for putting guys in the friend zone. She knew her value and she knew her worth.
Hey, who's hungry? You!
There we
go.
Hey.
Thank God. I'm starving.
But when she met 22-year-old Pete Smith, he seemed like someone who was worth her time.
They were hanging out. She really, really liked him.
He had this big personality just like she did. So as you can imagine, them together, they were the life of the party.
And just a year into the relationship, it took an exciting turn.
She was like, Terry, I'm pregnant. I'm like, what? And she was like, yeah, I'm supposed to have a baby.
She was very happy when she found out she was pregnant.
I just didn't believe it at the time that she was pregnant. So she must have really been in love with this young man.
She was ready to have a child and to have a family.
But just a few months before Mika's due date, tragedy struck.
The tragedy came about by homicide, where her partner Pete was unfortunately murdered.
Pete was another casualty of the gun violence plaguing Richmond.
Later in the summer, after her partner Pete died, Mika delivered her beautiful baby girl.
Caring for a newborn wasn't easy without Pete.
So she went to a little depressed stage, and she used to cry a lot.
Why don't you let me hold the baby for a little bit? Okay.
We all just took care of her because she always gave us joy, happiness. And now we had to turn around and be that support system, for her.
One such person who became a beacon for Mika in times of need was her close friend, Cameron.
Hey, Kiki. Brought you a little something.
Thanks, Cam.
You're welcome.
Cameron was a friend of the family. Like, we knew his relatives. They actually lived down the hill from us.
She really depended on him as a person to share her life with, get advice from, and to have a friendship with.
I don't know if I can do this without Pete.
Hey, you're not alone. We got you.
Cameron was a really good support system for her. He helped her get through that tough time.
And with her loved one's support, Mika was able to push through the heartbreak and embrace the joys of motherhood.
She loved being a mom.
Motherhood was the best thing that had ever happened to her.
But now, the safety of Mika and her daughter has been called into question after screams were heard from their apartment.
A neighbor called 911 after being woken up by the screaming.
I'm really concerned about my neighbor.
When officers arrive at Mika's apartment, they find her door ajar.
When you see an open door, then you know that there's trouble, there's a problem, so you have to be on guard and ready.
Is anyone here?
When they were clearing the living room area, it was obvious that there had been some type of struggle in there.
Things are all over the place, furniture is moved.
And then they find Mika.
Her hands are tied above her head, and there's a blanket covering her face.
Her underwear had also been pulled down, leading police to believe they may have been dealing with a case of sexual assault.
It's a tragic scene, but it's not a hopeless one.
The officer goes to check on her, and to his surprise, he finds out that she's still alive.
Get in your mess in here.
In January of 1999, 26-year-old single mom Mika Wadley was finding joy in motherhood.
She lost her partner, Pete, shortly after she became pregnant.
It had been a tough year for her. Her daughter was truly a light in the darkness for her.
But now Mika has been found unresponsive on the floor of her apartment after a neighbor reported the sound of screams.
Thankfully, there's still a chance to save her.
Get in your mess in here.
Paramedics responded and transported her to a local hospital.
But where is Mika's 18-month-old daughter?
There's no baby to be found.
We were panicked. We thought maybe there had been a kidnapping as well.
Fortunately, police soon learn that Mika's daughter is safe and sound with family.
She was at my grandmother's house. She was with us.
Upon hearing what's happened, Mika's sister Keela drops everything and heads straight to the hospital, where Mika is now in the ICU.
I got to the hospital and I said, "Where is she?" And he said, "Oh, they're working on her. Then I saw a glass door and you could see them working on her.
They were trying to resuscitate her, but it wasn't going well.
And then they came in the room and they said she died. And I said, what do you mean she did? They said they can't tell me nothing. And that was it.
When Keela communicates the tragic news to the rest of Mika's loved ones, they're equally devastated.
A lot of questions. Is this real? When you use a child, it's hard, you know.
To hear that your best friend is dead, that was the worst day of my life. Mika was so joyful, so full of life. Who would want to do something like that to her?
Back in Mika's apartment, detectives begin trying to answer that question.
What was initially a horrific and brutal assault has now become a homicide case.
Outside the residence, investigators locate an important clue.
I noticed that there was a large window screen resting against the fence.
Is this where the perpetrator entered? Is this how the person got into the home?
Inside the apartment, it's clear Mika put up a fight with her attacker.
There's clear evidence that there's been a violent struggle here.
The couch cushions, some were laying on the floor. There was blood evidence. There was a pair of platform boots, and one was missing a black shoelace. So we automatically assumed that how the suspect bound her wrist was by removing the shoelace from Mika's shoe.
Detectives believe sexual assault was the sole motive in this crime.
Her wallet was still there. There was jewelry that was still there.
Aside from the living room where the big fight happened, the house was otherwise untouched. There wasn't anything obvious missing.
But that's not the only reason police think they can rule out robbery as a motive.
When first responders found her, she had a blanket covering her face.
In my experience, when there are homicides or sexual assaults and it's a known offender, they will often cover the victim's face, almost like they didn't want to see the person in their last seconds.
That was a sign to investigators that it was likely someone that she knew.
In their search for answers, detectives turned to the neighbor who called 911, Andrew Piper.
He knew Mika. When he learned that she had been killed, it was devastating to him.
So when you went to check on her earlier this morning, was the door locked?
Well, at first it was.
After calling 911, he walked back to Mika's apartment.
And this time, the door was open.
This was startling to the neighbor in that just moments before, this door was locked.
I thought about going to check in on her at that point, but I was afraid.
He had a little bit of remorse because despite the door being open, he chose not to go in.
Was there anyone else in the vicinity while all of this was going on?
Well, there was this one guy.
He noticed that there was a man in the distance exiting the apartment complex. He was too far away to get a good look, but he believed that he was wearing a beanie and a gray sweatshirt.
His pace and his gait didn't lend one to believe like he was running from the scene. I mean, could it just be a random person just walking toward the bus stop?
Regardless, it's the only real lead investigators have at this point.
Although the 911 caller couldn't give a really detailed description, he was able to give the officers enough to put out an APB for someone wearing a gray sweatshirt and a beanie.
Could this man be the key to unlocking the case?
Detectives in Richmond, California are investigating the death of beloved 26-year-old single mother, Mika Wadley.
Mika Wadley was murdered inside her apartment.
And the only lead they have so far is a vague one.
A neighbor saw a man he didn't recognize leaving the apartment complex after the crime took place. But the man wasn't exhibiting any suspicious behavior, so it's not clear if he had anything to do with it.
As officers continue putting feelers out for this mysterious individual, detectives receive word that the results of Mika's autopsy are in.
Her autopsy spoke volumes. Mika died in probably the most personal way that you can die. She was smothered. That takes a while to take place, and that's very painful.
But according to the autopsy, Mika wasn't sexually assaulted.
She was a firecracker, and she fought him tooth and nail until the end.
She must have fought so hard that her killer was not successful in that regard.
Detectives suspect that after the killer heard Andrew Piper knocking on the door, he knew his time was limited.
When she screamed, he had to know that someone was going to come. He had to know that if he didn't prevent Mika from being able to tell anybody who he was, he, unfortunately for Mika, had to make a decision.
So he smothered her to keep her quiet, and when he thought she was dead, he fled the scene.
But who is he? Investigators hope Mika's family can provide some insight.
Can you think of anyone who would want to attack Mika?
No, everybody loved her.
If you seen her as a person, you wouldn't think she had no enemies at all.
I just couldn't see why someone would want to take her life.
What about a boyfriend? Was she seeing anyone?
Probably in any homicide case where you have a woman who's been killed, I mean, the first person that police always look at is a boyfriend.
But she wasn't with anybody.
After her ex died, she kind of gave up on dating.
She'd just been focused on her daughter and wasn't trying to get into a relationship anytime soon.
So you can't think of anyone that she may have been out with on Friday night?
Mika's family reveals she did go out with someone that evening.
But he's just a friend.
What is his name?
Cameron King.
The detectives learned that the night before, Mika and her good friend Cameron had dropped off Mika's daughter with Mika's family so that the two of them can go see a movie.
The family tells me that he is somebody that she had known for about 6 or 7 years after meeting at a local junior college.
He was real goofy like her. They would just go to the movies and hang out, but she wasn't like attracted to him.
However, Mika's family says Cameron was clearly vying for something more.
And he definitely wanted to date her.
The way that Cameron would kind of gush around, when Mika would speak, they were pretty confident in knowing that he had a crush on her.
Oftentimes, when they were hanging out late, Mika would allow Cameron to crash on her couch, and he would leave early in the morning before she would wake up.
However, the family says a few weeks earlier, Cameron had exhibited some strange behavior.
They didn't really feel, initially anyway, that he would ever act on his feelings, except several weeks prior to Mika's homicide. Mika shared with her sisters that one night Cameron was over watching a movie. She went to bed. He was going to sleep on the couch and then let himself out.
But when she woke up in the middle of the night, she saw Cameron sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her.
Cameron, what are you doing?
Hey, I'm sorry. I'm just gonna go. I'm gonna leave. Okay. I'm sorry.
It really freaked Mika out.
Based on this unsettling information, detectives can't help but wonder if Cameron had something to do with Mika's death.
At this point, the urgency to speak to him has now increased because here we have a young woman that was found naked from the waist down and having a male friend that I was told that also was infatuated with her, that was close to her, and that may have wanted more.
Maybe he can no longer deal with the rejection and finally snap.
In January of 1999, detectives investigating the homicide of 26-year-old single mother Mika Wadley are growing suspicious of her friend, Cameron King.
Apparently, Cameron wanted more than just a friendship from Mika, but Mika wasn't into him like that.
Cameron, what are you doing?
Maybe he can no longer deal with the rejection and finally snapped.
Investigators waste no time locating Cameron and bring him in for an interview.
We need to speak with you about your friend Mika.
What about her?
Cameron was informed that Mika was brutally murdered.
Wow, that's just too bad.
You would have expected sobbing, crying, or some shock, and that did not take place with Cameron.
You were close, right?
Yeah, we were close.
I remember sitting in the interview and being very much taken aback by this. Like, we could have been talking about, a sporting event, and it would have been the same.
Did you ever have any romantic feelings for Mika?
Nah.
He flatly denied it. He said that they were just friends and that was not an interest on his part.
Did you watch her in her sleep?
Nah.
He said, no, never happened. I never made any advances on her.
He made it appear as if she were the one that really wanted to be with him.
There was a part of me that felt that he was trying to distance himself from her romantically, given how she died. And I honestly wasn't buying it.
We believe you were the last person to see Mika before she was killed. That does not look good for you.
They asked him to walk them through what he and Mika did on Friday the 8th.
Damn. We just went to see a movie, okay?
And nothing else happened?
That's when Cameron admits that there was something odd that Mika said to him that night.
She knew she was gonna die.
According to Cameron, Mika actually brought up her impending death that night.
And I'll be honest with you, when he said that to me, like, the hair on my neck stood up.
Cam, if I died tonight, would you come to my funeral?
Come on, quit playing.
Promise me you'll come.
All right. Okay, Kiki. I promise I'll be there, okay? But you gotta stop acting so morbid, all right?
Well, did you ever ask her why she felt that way?
Not really. I just changed the subject, it kind of creeped me out.
Which is unusual. If they're such good friends, I would expect him to question, well, what's wrong? Is somebody following you? Like, why would you say that? And he didn't.
After the movie got out around 12:30 a.m., Cameron states that he dropped Mika off at her apartment.
You sure you didn't spend the night?
Not this time.
He leaves and he returns home to his apartment in Oakland, which is about 20 minutes away.
When you dropped her off, did you happen to notice one of the windows had the screen removed?
I asked him, are your fingerprints going to be on the window? Remember, there was an open window, and his response was, no, I didn't crawl through no window. Again, another red flag, and I challenged him on it. I said, I didn't mention anybody crawling through an open window.
At this point, investigators are extremely suspicious.
But Cameron insists that he was home all night after dropping Mika off.
I dropped her off, I went straight home, got there at 1:30, didn't go anywhere. Went straight to bed. Didn't leave until 10:30 the next morning when I went to work.
Can anyone else corroborate that?
That's when Cameron drops a bombshell.
Cameron says, yes, you can ask my wife.
Cameron is not a single man. He's been in a relationship with a woman named Whitney Clark for 4 years.
She is basically his common law wife that they have a child together.
It suddenly seems extremely strange that he's going out on what seems like a date with another woman to the movies.
This really got the detective's attention because she might be a person that had a motive. Her husband was spending the night at Mika's home, taking her to movies, spending a large amount of time with her.
Investigators contact Whitney Clark, and she agrees to come into the station for an interview.
They started off by asking her if it troubled her that Cameron left her alone so that he could take another woman out to a movie.
Not really. They were just friends. I met her a time or two.
They asked her, did Cameron come home on the night of the 8th? After he took Mika to the movies, and she said yes.
She corroborates Cameron's story. She says that Cameron comes home at 1:30 a.m., gets into bed with her, they watch some TV.
Then they went to bed, and he left for work around 10:30 the next morning.
We know that her neighbor phoned the police around 7:30 a.m. after hearing her screams.
There's no way he could have had anything to do with what happened with Mika.
In her mind, he couldn't have been responsible because he was in bed with her.
You're sure?
100%.
They asked her, would you be willing to take a polygraph test? And she says yes.
The investigators hooked her up to the lie detector machine, and the examiner begins a series of questions.
But it doesn't take long for the needle to spike.
The text comes back positive for deception, that she's not telling the truth.
Richmond detectives are in the midst of interviewing Whitney Clark about the murder of 26-year-old single mother, Mika Wadley.
Her common-law husband, Cameron King, was the last person to see Mika alive before she was killed.
Whitney has denied having anything to do with Mika's murder and says she was at home with her young daughter that morning. According to Whitney, Cameron was home too. But is she telling the truth?
So, as a part of her questioning, Cameron's wife was asked to take a polygraph test that she unfortunately failed.
The two questions on which she was deemed untruthful were, are you certain Cameron came home at 1:30 a.m.? And are you covering up for your husband?
Whitney, we know you aren't being totally honest with us here.
Okay. Okay.
Whitney admits that Cameron's close relationship with Mika bothered her more than she initially let on.
She breaks down and admits, yes, it upset me that my husband went out with this woman.
In fact, she was really upset because she believed that Cameron had taken $20 from out of her pocket in order to go to the movies.
Imagine if someone used your hard-earned cash to buy another woman's movie ticket and popcorn. Right, it made my blood boil.
But Whitney maintains that Cameron did return home by 1:30 a.m.
She had stayed up until he arrived home at 1:30 in the morning because she was going to confront him about the money that he had stolen from her to take Mika out.
So after Cameron got home later that night after dropping off Mika, he and his wife had an argument.
The argument went on for a while until Cameron said he was done arguing and crawled into bed and went to sleep.
She woke at 10:30 in the morning. Cameron was in bed with her. She said, I'm a sound sleeper. I slept right through until 10:30 a.m. Well, if you were soundly asleep, how would you know if Cameron would have gotten up and left and returned home?
Mika was killed around 7:30 a.m. It's entirely possible that Cameron could have gone back to Mika's and killed her, and then snuck back into bed before his wife woke up.
After speaking with Whitney, detectives circle back around to Cameron and issue another polygraph test. Will he also show signs of deception?
During the polygraph examination, Cameron did pass some of the test questions. Questions where he works, where he lives, things of that nature.
Then, as the questions get related to the incident and more complicated, all of a sudden, he is found untruthful on two questions.
The first question is, were you present when Mika Wadley was injured? The second question was, did you have anything to do with the death of Mika Wadley?
He failed miserably on both those questions.
It's been looking more and more to investigators like they've zeroed in on their main suspect.
But Cameron insists they've got it all wrong.
When I continued to press him, he just continued to announce his innocence. I didn't do it. I was home.
You're wasting your time. I didn't do it.
All of this adding up is unsettling. His story felt very manufactured. And I felt like at that moment that I could have been looking at a killer.
Detectives take DNA and fingerprint samples from both Cameron and Whitney.
But once it's run through the lab and compared to the DNA at the crime scene, detectives are surprised to learn it was, in fact, not a match.
Are you sure?
There's no DNA from Cameron or his wife that's at the crime scene that's on Mika.
So now, They had to start from square one.
If Cameron wasn't involved, they can't rule out that this was a completely random crime.
So that was really what we were fearing, is that we had a serial rapist on our hands.
Despite the setback, investigators continue to diligently work on the case.
Our focus was still continuing to see, if not Cameron, then who. And we just continue to forge ahead and try to identify the person.
Police acquired a list of every known sex offender in the area, and they interviewed each one of them to make sure that they had a rock-solid alibi.
But their efforts prove unfruitful.
So days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, and the case became cold.
So, I mean, you can imagine how difficult this would be for Mika's family.
Beside being disappointed that they may never get justice, they're also worried about their own safety.
I'm scared to go in my own house because you have that in the head. Who is it? Is it someone I know? Am I talking to this person? Like, why? Like, I could be next to them.
As time drags on, Detective Kern eventually retires. But even in retirement, Mika's case stays on her mind.
I still kept kind of one foot in the door, would still ask the cold case, hey, how are we? Where are we with this? Is there anything more we can do?
She made a promise to the family that they would catch Mika's killer, and she wanted to make good on that promise.
And in 2020, 21 years after Mika's death, a new team of investigators starts making headway with the help of recent technological advances.
DNA technology had come a long way.
Parts of the fingernail clippings and ligatures that had not been tested was tested.
The new team also takes a look at the shoelace that was wrapped around Mika's hand, and they're able to find DNA from that shoelace. That's also the DNA from a male donor. The question now is, who is the donor? Where did this DNA come from?
To be perfectly transparent, throughout the whole 20 years, I believed it was Cameron.
But the new DNA samples still aren't a match for Cameron King or his wife.
I was speechless. All roads led to Cameron, and yet it wasn't Cameron. You could have knocked me down with a feather, honestly. Like, I was taken aback, just shocked.
One of the most shocking aspects of this case are the polygraph results, which is in contrast with the physical evidence. Even though the polygraph shows signs of deception, it's hard to argue with DNA evidence.
Most people don't understand what it's like to be inside of a police room, be asked questions. It's very stressful. It's very unnerving.
And it's quite possible the stress that Cameron was feeling in the interrogation room caused him to fail the polygraph test.
But even though investigators have hit a wall with their prime suspect, they continue to push on.
They started using public DNA databases, meaning 23andMe and all the ones where you put your own information and DNA in so you could find lost relatives.
Against all odds, they get a hit, and it was someone no one ever expected.
I'm like, what? For real? I know him.
"21 years have passed since the murder of beloved single mother, Mika Wadley. But now detectives may finally have the lead they've been waiting for.
So after 20 years with the advances in technologies, detectives decided to reopen this case and to test DNA with new measures.
They started using public DNA databases, meaning 23andMe and all the ones where you put your own information and DNA in so you could find lost relatives.
Against all odds, they get a hit, and it was someone no one ever expected.
His name is Jerry Lee Henderson.
His name has never come up, not one time throughout this 20-year investigation.
Richmond Police Department contacted the family and showed a picture, and they asked, do you know the name of Jerry Lee Henderson? And at that time, they had no knowledge of anybody by that name.
I told her I don't recognize the picture. I don't know him.
But Mika's best friend, Terry Adams, recognizes the name immediately.
Keela gave me a call and said, Terry, they found out who killed Mika. And I'm like, what? For real? And then she said it was a guy named Jerry Henderson. You know him? I'm like, yes, I know him.
Jerry Lee had attended some classes at junior college with Mika. He was kind of an acquaintance, but not anybody that she would speak of frequently.
We all went to Contra Costa College. We would just hang out, but I couldn't see the connection with Jerry and Mika because they weren't friends outside of us being all together.
Around the time Mika was killed, Jerry had been down on his luck.
He was having problems trying to have work and find a place to live. He'd actually been kicked out of his place.
He was homeless at some point.
So the million-dollar question is, why?
Why and how he ended up at her home that night.
So one theory that was put forward was that Jerry may have been coming to Mika's apartment in search of a place to stay because he had been kicked out.
So investigators believe he most likely snuck in through the window early in the morning, thinking Mika wasn't home. When he made it through the window and spotted Mika asleep, something in him must have snapped and decided he wanted more than just a place to stay.
Investigators believe he spotted her boots on the floor and quietly removed one of the shoelaces.
What are you doing? Let me go! Stop! Jerry, stop!
So he binds her wrist and he's trying to sexually assault her.
But Mika fought back.
She's on the couch. She's pushing and she's fighting. She gave it her all.
That's why we have this evidence of this struggle. She must have fought really hard in order to make sure he wouldn't do what he was trying to do.
She bled pretty well from her defensive wounds.
All this while Mika was screaming at the top of her lungs, so loud that it woke her neighbor.
Mika! When Jerry heard the knocks at the door, he began to panic.
He wraps her with the blanket really quick to quiet her.
But she wasn't quiet enough, so he smothered her.
Stop fighting. Shut up.
Mika fought her hardest, but unfortunately it wasn't enough to save her life.
But Mika's struggle, her fight, her tenacity prevented this perpetrator from sexually assaulting her. So if there's anything that the family can have some type of peace with, it's that she was not sexually violated.
No one knows for sure if the man that Andrew Piper saw walking out of the apartment complex that day was Jerry, but it certainly seems likely.
Now that we have a name, and now that we have a DNA match, detectives want to speak to Jerry Lee Henderson.
But they find that they can't do that. They can't do that ever because Jerry Lee died 11 days after Mika's murder.
Although Jerry's cause of death was never confirmed, it appeared to be a drug overdose.
This is a bittersweet resolution that in some ways feels a little bit hollow because, we'll never be able to confront Jerry Lee Henderson and ask, why did you do this? What was your motivation?
Some of the answers we'll never have.
And unfortunately, Jerry Lee Henderson has taken that secret to his grave.
Mika's family is glad they have answers. However, a part of them still remains unconvinced.
That young man didn't do that. It don't make sense. It doesn't add up.
Jerry Henderson, he was the nicest guy. Jerry was really laid back and quiet. I just couldn't see what would do something like that.
They said he OD'd, but there ain't no drugs in his system. If you read it, that's what they said.
He didn't club. He didn't drink. He wasn't interested in the kind of stuff.
To be honest with you, I don't know if he was working with someone, but I honestly feel he might have been there, but it's more to this story, but we will never know.
It's tough. I sometimes look back and wonder, could I have done more? Were there things that I missed? And I guess I'll never have those answers either.
And while there are still so many questions, one thing is for certain. Mika will forever live on in the hearts of all that knew her.
Mika was a very sweet person. Unfortunately, this happened to her that shouldn't happen to her. She didn't deserve this at all.
Her daughter resembled her mama quite a bit. So, I get a chance to see Mika again in a way of speaking.
It's like hard, but we just have to keep going. She's here in spirit.
There are crimes that dominate headlines for weeks before fading into history. And then there are crimes that refuse to disappear, lingering in the memory of a community for decades like a question no one can answer. Some cases grow colder with every passing year. Witnesses move away. Evidence gathers dust inside forgotten storage rooms. Detectives retire, convinced they have exhausted every lead. Families learn to live beside grief that never truly fades. Yet every so often, one forgotten file is opened again. One overlooked piece of evidence is examined with technology that did not exist when tragedy first struck. And suddenly, an investigation that seemed destined to remain unsolved begins to move once more. The murder of 11-year-old Linda O'Keefe became one of those cases, a crime that haunted Southern California for nearly half a century before modern forensic science finally revealed the identity of the man investigators had been searching for all along. The morning of July 6th, SIL 1973, began like countless other summer mornings in Newport Beach, California. The city carried an image of safety. Quiet neighborhoods lined with palm trees. Children riding bicycles through residential streets. Families preparing for vacations while schools remained closed for summer break. It was the kind of community where parents believed their children could still walk familiar routes without fear. Few could have imagined that before the day was over, the city would become the scene of one of the most heartbreaking child murder investigations in its history. Linda O'Keefe was 11 years old. Friends and family remembered her as bright, energetic, and responsible beyond her years. She loved spending time outdoors, enjoyed sports, and looked forward to ordinary childhood adventures that most people eventually forget. Nothing about that Friday suggested it would become the final chapter of her young life. That morning, Linda attended a summer swim practice held at the local school. She had participated many times before. It was part of her normal routine, one her parents had every reason to trust. Children gathered at the pool under the California sun, laughing between practice drills, unaware that somewhere nearby a predator was watching the world move exactly as it always had. When practice ended shortly before noon, Linda began walking home alone. The distance was not great. It was a familiar route she had taken before. Witnesses later recalled seeing her carrying her towel, wearing her swimsuit beneath casual clothing, heading toward the neighborhood where her family waited. She never arrived. At first, nothing seemed unusual. A child running late could mean any number of innocent explanations. Perhaps she had stopped to visit a friend. Perhaps she had paused to buy a snack or talk with classmates. Minutes stretched into an hour. Concern slowly replaced patience. Her family began making phone calls. Friends had not seen her. Neighbors had no answers. Every passing moment made the silence heavier. Then came the realization every parent fears. Linda was missing. Within hours, Newport Beach police launched an extensive search. Officers canvassed neighborhoods. Volunteers joined the effort. Cars drove slowly through residential streets while people called her name across parks, empty lots, and school grounds. Search teams hoped they would find a frightened little girl who had become lost or injured. Instead, investigators would soon face evidence pointing towards something far darker. Witnesses began reporting a suspicious vehicle seen near the school around the time Linda disappeared. Descriptions varied, as eyewitness accounts often do under ordinary circumstances, but investigators believed they were searching for a light-colored van in 1973. Surveillance cameras were virtually non-existent. No security footage documented the streets. No mobile phones recorded passing traffic. Detectives depended almost entirely on human memory, and memory can become frustratingly unreliable once panic sets in. One witness believed they had seen Linda speaking with the driver. Another thought she may have been forced inside. Others could remember only fragments: a vehicle, a direction of travel, a moment that seemed unimportant until news spread that a child had vanished. Every small detail suddenly mattered. Investigators raced against time because statistics have always shown that the first hours after a child abduction are the most critical. Every minute without answers gives a kidnapper greater opportunity to escape, conceal evidence, or cross county lines before police establish coordinated searches. Roadblocks were considered. Descriptions were broadcast to surrounding law enforcement agencies. Officers interviewed anyone who might have crossed Linda's path. Still, the trail was already beginning to fade. Late that afternoon, the search came to a devastating end. Linda's body was discovered several miles away in a field near Back Bay Drive. The location stood in painful contrast to the neighborhoods where children had spent the morning swimming under bright sunshine. What investigators encountered transformed a missing person investigation into a homicide that would remain one of Orange County's most haunting mysteries. The crime scene immediately revealed signs of extreme violence. Detectives carefully documented every detail they could preserve. Forensic investigators photographed the area, collected trace evidence, and searched for footprints, tire impressions, fibers, and anything that might identify the killer. In the early 1970s, forensic science was advancing, but many of the tools that modern investigators now consider routine simply did not exist. DNA profiling had not yet entered criminal investigations. Genetic genealogy was decades away. Detectives relied on fingerprints, blood typing, witness interviews, physical evidence, and painstaking investigative work. If the killer left no fingerprints, if no one recognized him, if no witness remembered his face, the investigation could stall indefinitely. That terrifying reality confronted detectives almost immediately. News spread rapidly across Southern California. Parents who had once allowed children to walk alone suddenly changed household rules overnight. Schools reviewed safety procedures. Communities organized neighborhood patrols. Local newspapers published photographs of Linda beside urgent appeals for information. Television stations interrupted regular programming with updates, hoping someone would recognize the suspect vehicle before it disappeared forever. The emotional impact reached far beyond Newport Beach. People saw their own children in Linda's photograph. Her smile appeared ordinary. Her life seemed ordinary. That was exactly what made the crime so frightening. Nothing about her family suggested they had been targeted. Nothing warned the community that a predator might already be among them. Investigators pursued every lead that arrived. Phone calls flooded police headquarters. Some callers believed they had seen suspicious men near schools. Others reported similar vans parked in unfamiliar neighborhoods. Tips arrived from surrounding counties. Most proved impossible to verify, and some contradicted one another completely. Yet detectives followed them because ignoring even one legitimate lead could mean losing the only chance to identify the killer. The artists produced composite sketches based on witness recollections. Officers compared known offenders living throughout California. Recently released prisoners became subjects of interest. Individuals previously accused of crimes against children were interviewed. Every potential suspect required time. Every interview consumed precious resources. Still, none of them produced evidence strong enough to make an arrest. Behind the scenes, investigators also began examining whether Linda's murder might connect two other unsolved crimes. Serial offenders often repeat patterns, similar victim profiles, similar methods of approach, similar locations where victims were abandoned. Detectives across jurisdictions exchanged reports, searching for similarities that could reveal whether one dangerous individual had committed multiple attacks. No definitive connection emerged. The uncertainty only deepened the mystery. Was the murderer a local resident? A passing stranger? Someone who had carefully planned the abduction? Or someone who acted on sudden impulse before disappearing forever? Every theory carried weaknesses. Every possibility opened new questions. Linda's family entered a reality no family should ever experience. Instead of watching a daughter grow through middle school and high school, they found themselves speaking with homicide detectives, attending memorial services, and answering endless questions from investigators searching desperately for overlooked details. Had Linda mentioned anyone unusual? Had she recently felt frightened? Had strangers approached her before? The answers brought little comfort. She had simply gone to swim practice. She had started walking home. And she vanished. As weeks became months, investigators reviewed evidence repeatedly. Maps covered conference room tables. Pins marked witness sightings. Timelines were reconstructed hour by hour. Detectives revisited neighborhoods, hoping someone who had remained silent might finally remember an important detail. Sometimes cold cases are not created by lack of effort. Sometimes they are created because the available science has reached its limits. That appeared to be exactly what had happened here. Evidence existed, but the technology capable of unlocking its secrets had not yet been invented. Years passed. The headlines disappeared. New tragedies replaced old ones. Detectives transferred to different assignments. Some retired. Others passed away. Boxes containing reports, photographs, laboratory notes, and physical evidence were carefully archived, waiting for a future generation of investigators who might see something their predecessors could not. Yet Linda's name never completely vanished from Orange County. Every anniversary brought renewed media attention. Each article ended with the same haunting reality. No arrest. No conviction. No answers. Parents who remembered the summer of 1973 continued telling younger generations about the day fear changed their community forever. Children who had grown up alongside Linda became adults carrying memories of police cars, search parties, and newspaper headlines they never forgot. For many residents, the passage of time did not erase the crime. It simply transformed it into a permanent scar, a reminder that evil can appear without warning in places that seem safest. Investigators refused to destroy the physical evidence collected from the crime scene, despite the passing decades. That decision would eventually prove critical, although no one in 1973 could have predicted why. Somewhere inside carefully preserved evidence lay microscopic clues that future technology might one day reveal. The detectives could not yet read those clues, but they understood something important. Science evolves. What appears impossible today may become routine tomorrow. As the years rolled into decades, the Linda O'Keefe investigation settled into the category every detective dreads a cold case. The file remained open, but meaningful progress seemed almost impossible. Witness memories faded. Some individuals connected to the investigation died before seeing justice. Entire generations grew up without knowing the details of the crime, while the man responsible continued living somewhere beyond the reach of investigators, carrying a secret that had survived year after year without exposure. No one could yet know that the evidence quietly waiting inside police storage would eventually meet a revolutionary form of forensic science. No one could imagine that decades after detectives first walked that lonely crime scene under the blazing California sun, a single breakthrough in DNA technology would begin unraveling one of the state's oldest unsolved child murder cases, bringing investigators closer than ever before to the truth they had pursued for nearly 50 years. For investigators, the hardest part of any homicide is not always arriving at the crime scene. It is waking up weeks later with no new leads, no credible suspects, and no certainty that tomorrow will be any different. In the Linda O'Keefe investigation, that reality settled in with relentless force. Every day that passed without an arrest widened the distance between the killer and the evidence left behind. Detectives understood a painful truth that every homicide investigator eventually faces. Memories fade far faster than physical evidence, but physical evidence is only valuable if science can explain what it means. The first weeks after Linda's murder became a blur of interviews, reports, and long hours inside cramped detective offices. Thousands of pages of notes began filling the case file. Officers retraced Linda's route from the swimming pool to the place where she was last seen alive. They measured distances, timed walking speeds, and reconstructed minute-by-minute timelines in hopes of identifying the exact window during which she disappeared. The timeline was disturbingly narrow. Linda had left her swim practice shortly before noon. Witnesses confirmed seeing her walking alone toward home. Sometime during that short journey, she encountered the person who would take her life. Detectives believed the abduction happened quickly. There were no widespread reports of screams. No one recalled seeing a prolonged struggle in broad daylight. Whatever happened unfolded in moments, leaving almost nothing behind except uncertainty. The possibility that the offender had carefully planned the attack immediately became one of the investigation's central questions. Was Linda specifically targeted? Or had the killer simply been searching for any vulnerable child? That distinction mattered. A targeted crime suggested familiarity. A random attack suggested an unknown predator capable of striking again. Investigators refused to assume either possibility without evidence. Instead, they examined every aspect of Linda's life: her school, her friends, her extracurricular activities, her family's routine, neighbors, relatives, teachers, coaches. Anyone who had interacted with her became part of the investigation. Nothing suggested that Linda had enemies or had been involved in circumstances that pointed towards someone close to the family. Friends consistently described her as cheerful and responsible. Teachers remembered an ordinary student enjoying the freedom of summer vacation. Family members could think of no one who might wish to harm her. The absence of an obvious suspect forced detectives to widen their search. Attention quickly shifted towards strangers who had been seen in the area during the days leading up to the murder. Police circulated descriptions of suspicious vehicles and individuals reported by witnesses. One recurring detail continued appearing throughout interviews: a light-colored van observed near the school and surrounding neighborhood. In modern investigations, surveillance cameras often answer questions that witnesses cannot. Streets, parking lots, businesses, and traffic intersections are routinely monitored. In 1973, detectives had no such advantage. If someone drove away unnoticed, there was rarely any recording to review later. Instead, investigators relied entirely upon human observation. And human observation is imperfect. Some witnesses believed the van was white. Others insisted it appeared tan. One person remembered side windows. Another believed there were none. License plate numbers proved impossible to confirm. Each interview produced fragments rather than certainty. Composite sketches were developed based on accounts of a possible driver. Detectives distributed these images across California, hoping another law enforcement agency or perhaps an ordinary citizen might recognize the face. Hundreds of copies appeared in police stations and newspapers. Nothing produced the breakthrough investigators desperately needed. The flood of public attention generated thousands of tips. Every telephone call had to be documented. Every allegation required follow-up. Some callers sincerely believed they possessed critical information. Others confused Linda's case with unrelated incidents. False sightings multiplied. Rumors spread quickly. A suspicious neighbor, an unfamiliar delivery driver, a traveler staying briefly at a motel. Each possibility demanded attention until evidence ruled it out. Weeks became months, and the investigation consumed enormous resources. Orange County detectives worked alongside neighboring agencies whenever new information crossed jurisdictional lines. They examined reports involving attempted child abductions throughout Southern California. Similar methods were compared. Similar vehicles were cataloged. Detectives wondered whether Linda's killer had attacked before or whether he intended to strike again. Law enforcement across the United States was confronting a troubling reality during the 1970s. Several high-profile child abduction and homicide cases had shaken public confidence. Communities once considered exceptionally safe suddenly faced crimes that seemed almost impossible to prevent. Parents became increasingly cautious. Children who had once walked to parks alone were now escorted by adults. Schools expanded discussions about stranger safety long before such programs became common nationwide. Linda's murder became part of that larger national conversation, not because investigators had answers, but because they had none. The uncertainty frightened people more than certainty ever could. Behind closed doors, detectives revisited the crime scene repeatedly. Photographs were spread across conference tables. Measurements were checked and rechecked. Investigators scrutinized tire impressions collected from the location where Linda's body had been found. They examined footprints preserved in photographs, soil samples, plant material, fibers, hairs. Everything that might someday identify the offender was carefully preserved. A laboratory science of the era could only accomplish so much. Blood typing could narrow possibilities. Microscopic comparisons could suggest similarities. Fingerprints could establish identity if a suspect already existed for comparison. A DNA analysis remained years away. Without it, many biological traces could not provide the answers investigators desperately sought. The case gradually shifted from an active emergency into a long-term investigation. But detectives refused to call it hopeless. Fresh interviews continued. Witnesses were recontacted months later in case forgotten memories resurfaced. Psychologists had long recognized that traumatic events sometimes unlock additional details over time. Investigators hoped someone might suddenly recall a license plate, a conversation, or an unfamiliar face. Occasionally, new information did emerge. Unfortunately, each promising lead eventually collapsed under scrutiny. One suspect possessed a vehicle resembling witness descriptions. His whereabouts were verified. Another individual had a troubling criminal history involving violence. Physical evidence excluded him. His several anonymous letters accused different men of committing the crime. None survived investigation. The file grew larger. The answers did not. Meanwhile, Linda's family continued living with unimaginable loss. Birthdays came and went. Yet holidays arrived carrying empty spaces that could never be filled. Every milestone became another reminder of what had been stolen. Families of homicide victims often describe grief as something frozen in time. While the world continues moving forward, they remain emotionally connected to the day everything changed. For the O'Keefe family, July 6, SIL 1973, never truly ended. Public attention slowly faded. The news organizations shifted toward newer stories. Television cameras disappeared. Only occasional anniversary articles reminded readers that one of Orange County's most devastating child murders remained unsolved. Inside police headquarters, however, Linda's name never disappeared. The file continued changing hands as detectives retired and younger investigators assumed responsibility. Each new detective inherited not only boxes of evidence, but also decades of frustration accumulated by those who came before. Cold cases present a unique challenge. Unlike active investigations, they arrive carrying years of dead ends, disproven theories, and faded memories. Every new investigator must learn the entire history before attempting to discover something everyone else has overlooked. Some detectives become emotionally attached. Others maintain professional distance. Nearly all understand one uncomfortable reality. The victim cannot ask for justice. The investigation must speak on her behalf. By the late 1970s, the Linda O'Keefe murder had become one of Southern California's most enduring unsolved crimes. Yet detectives continued asking difficult questions. Had the killer remained in California? Had he committed murders elsewhere under another jurisdiction? Was he imprisoned for unrelated offenses? Or had he simply lived an ordinary life while carrying knowledge no one else possessed? Those questions had no immediate answers. Investigators began reviewing national crime databases as they expanded during subsequent years. Technological improvements allowed agencies to compare reports more efficiently than before, but progress remained slow. Digital records were still limited. Many older investigations existed only on paper inside filing cabinets scattered across the country. Connecting crimes committed in different states often depended on determined investigators recognizing similar patterns. Pattern analysis became increasingly important. Offenders frequently repeated behaviors. Choice of victim. A method of approach. Geographic preferences. Disposition of evidence. Behavior before and after the crime. Behavioral analysts examined these elements carefully. Some believed Linda's killer demonstrated planning. Others argued the attack suggested opportunity rather than long-term preparation. Without identifying the offender, definitive conclusions remained impossible. As years passed, another challenge emerged. Witnesses aged. Some moved away. Others passed away entirely. Potential testimony that might once have been available vanished forever. The investigation was now fighting not only against an unknown killer, but also against time itself. Still, detectives preserved everything. Every evidence envelope. Every photograph. Every handwritten note. Every laboratory report. Those decisions reflected remarkable foresight. Long before DNA transformed criminal investigations, experienced detectives understood that future scientific advances might reveal information impossible to obtain in their own era. Destroying evidence could permanently eliminate opportunities that had not yet been imagined. The physical evidence from Linda's case therefore remained protected under carefully controlled conditions. Decade after decade. Waiting. Unchanged. Silent. Outside law enforcement, California itself transformed dramatically. Neighborhoods expanded. Roads changed. Businesses replaced empty lots. Children who had attended school with Linda grew into parents themselves. Many newcomers to Newport Beach knew nothing about the tragedy that had once dominated local headlines. Yet longtime residents remembered. Some could still describe where they were when they first heard the news. Others remembered joining volunteer searches. Many never forgot the fear that spread through the community that summer. For parents raising children in the years afterward, Linda's story became a warning repeated countless times. Walk together. Stay alert. Don't accept rides from strangers. Simple advice born from devastating experience. The investigation entered the 1980s carrying little momentum but refusing to close. Detectives periodically reviewed evidence whenever forensic laboratories announced improvements in scientific testing. Could blood evidence reveal something new? Could microscopic fibers now be compared more accurately? Could preserved biological material answer questions impossible to solve before? Each advancement generated cautious optimism. Each review ended with the same disappointment. The available technology still could not identify an unknown offender from biological evidence alone. That capability simply did not yet exist. Nevertheless, the evidence survived. Locked away, cataloged, protected, waiting for a future that investigators could barely imagine. Somewhere beyond the shelves of evidence storage, the person responsible for Linda O'Keefe's murder continued living in freedom. Whether he believed he had escaped forever or whether he quietly feared discovery remained unknown. He aged as the investigation aged. His appearance changed. His routines changed. Entire decades passed between the crime and the scientific revolution that would eventually reshape homicide investigations around the world. No detective working the original case could have predicted exactly when that revolution would arrive. But it was coming. And when it finally reached Orange County, the fragile biological traces collected back in 1973, evidence preserved through patience, discipline, and remarkable foresight would become far more valuable than anyone standing at that original crime scene could ever have imagined. Time changes almost everything. Streets are renamed, buildings disappear, witnesses grow older, detectives retire, entire police departments evolve as new generations inherit investigations they never witnessed firsthand. But inside an evidence vault, time stands almost perfectly still. A sealed envelope remains sealed. A photograph never fades in memory because it has no memory to lose. A biological sample collected with careful hands decades earlier waits in silence, holding answers that no scientist of its own era could possibly unlock. That paradox became the defining reality of the Linda O'Keefe investigation. While the world outside continued racing forward, the most important witness in the case, the evidence itself, remained patiently waiting for science to catch up. Throughout the 1980s, forensic science entered a period of remarkable transformation. Laboratories around the world began experimenting with techniques capable of distinguishing one person's genetic profile from another. What initially appeared to be an extraordinary scientific breakthrough soon revealed enormous potential for criminal investigations. Cases that had depended almost entirely upon eyewitness testimony suddenly possessed another source of truth: DNA. For veteran detectives, the implications were astonishing. A suspect no longer needed to confess. A witness no longer needed to identify a face decades later. If biological evidence had been preserved properly, it might speak for itself. But progress came slowly. The earliest DNA testing methods required relatively large and well-preserved samples. Many older cases simply lacked suitable material. Laboratories were overwhelmed with requests, and testing remained expensive and limited. Agencies across the United States faced difficult decisions about which investigations should receive priority. Recent homicides naturally came first. Older cold cases often remained untouched. Linda O'Keefe's investigation continued waiting. Not because detectives had forgotten her, because the technology itself had not yet matured enough to provide realistic hope. Still, investigators never abandoned the file. Every few years, another detective reviewed the evidence inventory. Every review asked essentially the same question: has science advanced enough? Each answer edged a little closer toward yes. Meanwhile, entirely separate investigations across America demonstrated what DNA could accomplish. Wrongfully convicted individuals were exonerated after years behind bars. Violent offenders once believed impossible to identify suddenly found themselves linked to crimes committed decades apart. Prosecutors who had nearly abandoned certain homicide cases reopened them with renewed confidence. Law enforcement entered a new era. The phrase cold case began acquiring a different meaning. Previously, it implied resignation. Now it suggested possibility. If evidence still existed, hope still existed. That shift inspired agencies nationwide to re-examine long unsolved murders. Orange County investigators were no exception. The Linda O'Keefe file periodically returned to active review whenever advances in forensic biology justified another look. Specialists evaluated preserved evidence collected in 1973, determining whether modern laboratory methods might recover useful genetic material. The process demanded extraordinary caution. Evidence nearly 20 years old could not simply be handled casually. Contamination had to be avoided. Documentation had to remain meticulous. Every movement required careful recording because one mistake might permanently destroy irreplaceable material. The investigators understood exactly what was at stake. They possessed only one opportunity to perform certain tests. There would be no second chance. During these years, public memory of Linda's murder quietly endured. Anniversary newspaper articles occasionally revisited the investigation, reminding readers that the case remained open. Television stations interviewed detectives who continued expressing determination despite the lack of visible progress. Each interview carried a similar message. Someone knows something, as someone has remained silent. Even after all these years, detectives hoped publicity might encourage reluctant witnesses to come forward. Sometimes it did. Former residents contacted investigators after seeing anniversary coverage. Individuals reported suspicious memories from decades earlier. Some admitted they had dismissed certain observations at the time because they never imagined they might matter. Every new lead received attention. It most ultimately proved unrelated. Nevertheless, investigators never dismissed information simply because it arrived late. Cold cases teach detectives patience. And sometimes the smallest detail emerges after decades. Sometimes it changes everything. The challenge was separating meaningful information from ordinary human memory, which naturally changes over time. Psychological research has repeatedly shown that memories are reconstructed rather than replayed like recordings. Conversations, newspaper reports, and the passage of years can unintentionally alter recollections. Detectives therefore treated delayed witness statements carefully, comparing them against original reports created much closer to the crime itself. Occasionally, similarities reinforced credibility. More often, inconsistencies prevented investigators from relying upon them. Physical evidence remained far more dependable. Unlike memory, it never tried to fill missing gaps. It simply waited. As forensic laboratories improved their capabilities during the 1990s, DNA profiling became increasingly accepted inside courtrooms throughout the United States. Prosecutors successfully used genetic evidence to secure convictions in cases where traditional investigative methods had reached their limits. The success stories spread rapidly. One unsolved homicide after another suddenly found new life. Detectives who had once accepted retirement without answers returned to watch former investigations finally reach court. Families who had spent decades wondering if justice would ever arrive found themselves sitting inside courtrooms hearing guilty verdicts they once believed impossible. These victories inspired agencies everywhere. Orange County investigators again examined Linda's evidence. Could her case become one of them? Laboratory specialists carefully assessed preserved biological material. As some samples remained unsuitable, others appeared more promising. Testing proceeded cautiously. The results provided valuable information but still failed to identify an unknown suspect directly. DNA profiles possess extraordinary power, but they require comparison. For nearly 4 decades, the Linda O'Keefe case had lived to very different lives. Inside Orange County law enforcement, it remained an active investigation waiting for the right scientific breakthrough. Outside police headquarters, it had become one of those tragic stories people remembered in fragments. Young girl who disappeared after swim practice, a community forever changed, a killer who simply vanished. Every anniversary revived the same haunting question. How could someone commit such a brutal crime in broad daylight and never be identified? The answer, investigators increasingly believed, was not that the killer had been exceptionally careful. It was that he had lived in an era before forensic science possessed the tools needed to expose him. By the early 2000s, DNA profiling had transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Countless violent offenders had been identified through state and national databases. Cases once considered impossible had reached courtrooms decades after the crimes occurred. Families finally received answers they had waited years to hear. Yet some investigations still refused to yield. Linda O'Keefe's murder was one of them. The biological evidence collected in 1973 continued to produce the same frustrating result. Detectives possessed a DNA profile believed to belong to the offender, but every search against available criminal databases ended the same way. No match. That absence became increasingly significant. Each year that passed meant more convicted offenders had their DNA entered into national systems. If the unknown profile still failed to match anyone, investigators began considering a troubling possibility. Perhaps the killer had never been arrested for another qualifying crime. Or perhaps he had managed to avoid leaving biological evidence in every offense committed afterward. Either possibility suggested that traditional database searching might never solve the case. Detectives understood they needed something entirely different. Around this time, cold case investigators across the country were beginning to pay close attention to an experimental investigative strategy that existed outside conventional criminal databases. The idea was both simple and revolutionary. Millions of ordinary people were voluntarily submitting DNA samples to genealogy companies in hopes of learning about their ancestry. Most wanted to discover where their families came from. Some hoped to locate distant relatives. None intended to assist homicide investigations. Yet their genetic information revealed something remarkable. Every individual shares DNA with parents, grandparents, cousins, and distant relatives. Even if investigators could not identify an unknown offender directly, perhaps they could identify members of that person's extended family. From there, traditional detective work could begin narrowing possibilities. At first, many investigators viewed the concept cautiously. It had rarely been used. The legal and ethical questions were still developing. The process required enormous patience. Unlike fingerprint comparisons, genealogy did not produce instant answers. It produced possibilities. Entire family trees had to be reconstructed, birth records examined, marriage certificates located, military records reviewed, and census documents compared, obituaries studied. Each branch of a family tree could generate hundreds of names. Finding the correct individual required months of painstaking research. Still, the potential was extraordinary. Orange County investigators followed these developments with growing interest. The evidence from Linda's case had survived in remarkably good condition. If forensic genealogy continued proving successful elsewhere, perhaps her investigation might finally benefit. For years, detectives had imagined only two possible ways to solve the case: a confession or a database match. Now, for the first time, a third possibility emerged. The killer might unknowingly be identified through relatives who had never committed any crime at all. While science continued advancing, investigators never stopped reviewing the original evidence. Boxes first assembled in 1973 were opened once again. Photographs were digitized. Reports were scanned into modern record systems. Handwritten notes from retired detectives were preserved alongside contemporary forensic analyses. Every piece of information mattered. Cold case investigations often succeed, not because one clue suddenly appears, but because decades of existing information become easier to organize and compare. Technology improved investigative work in countless ways beyond DNA. Digital mapping allowed detectives to recreate routes with greater precision. Archived newspaper articles became searchable. Vehicle registrations from historical records could sometimes be reconstructed. Even forgotten witness statements occasionally revealed overlooked patterns when reviewed through modern investigative software. Nothing was taken for granted. The case was effectively being rebuilt for a new century. Investigators also revisited individuals who had attracted attention during earlier phases of the investigation. Some had died, others had relocated. Several willingly provided information once again. Advances in forensic science meant interviews conducted decades earlier could now be evaluated alongside evidence unavailable at the time. Even if previous suspects had been eliminated, detectives wanted absolute certainty. No possibility would remain unexplored. The emotional weight carried by investigators became impossible to ignore. Many of the detectives now assigned to Linda's case had not even entered law enforcement when she was murdered. Some had been children themselves in 1973. Yet after studying the evidence, reading witness statements, and meeting surviving family members, they developed the same determination that had driven every investigator before them. The passage of time had not reduced the importance of the crime. If anything, it had intensified the responsibility. Every year without justice represented another year stolen from the victim's family. Cold case detectives often describe themselves as temporary guardians. They inherit investigations from those who came before. Eventually, they pass them to someone else. Their responsibility is not necessarily to solve the case personally. It is to ensure the opportunity for justice survives. That philosophy shaped every decision surrounding the Linda O'Keefe investigation. Evidence preservation remained meticulous. Documentation remained exhaustive. Nothing would be discarded simply because decades had passed. Meanwhile, several groundbreaking homicide investigations elsewhere in the United States demonstrated that forensic genealogy could succeed where conventional DNA databases had failed. Cases abandoned for 30 or 40 years suddenly produced suspects. Unknown victims regained their identities. Families finally learned what had happened to missing loved ones. Within law enforcement, optimism spread cautiously. No one believed genealogy represented magic. Every successful case still required enormous investigative effort. But the impossible was beginning to look achievable. Orange County investigators recognized that Linda's case possessed many qualities necessary for this emerging technique. Preserved biological evidence, a usable DNA profile, extensive historical documentation, a clear timeline. The ingredients existed. The challenge lay in assembling them correctly. Obtaining suitable genetic analysis required specialized expertise beyond ordinary forensic laboratories. Detectives worked with experts capable of generating the type of DNA information needed for genealogical comparison. Unlike traditional forensic testing, which focuses primarily on identification, genealogy required far broader genetic data. Producing that information from evidence collected in 1973 demanded extraordinary care. Every laboratory procedure carried risk. Ancient biological samples can degrade. Contamination must be avoided completely. Scientists worked methodically, understanding they were handling evidence unlike almost anything else in the laboratory. For detectives, the waiting became almost unbearable. Months passed with little visible progress. Genealogy investigations rarely generate dramatic breakthroughs overnight. Instead, they advance through countless tiny discoveries. A distant cousin identified. A family branch confirmed. A surname eliminated. A historical document located. Each step appears insignificant until viewed together. Only then does a picture begin emerging. Investigators remained realistic. The offender could have thousands of distant relatives. Many records might be incomplete. Family histories often contain errors. Adoptions, name changes, and undocumented relationships can complicate genealogical reconstruction enormously. Still, every completed branch narrowed the search. Slowly, patiently, methodically. Throughout this period, Linda's family continued waiting with remarkable resilience. Nearly 4 decades had passed since that July afternoon. Children born after the murder had already become adults. Entire generations had lived without knowing the identity of the person responsible. Yet hope, though often quiet, never disappeared completely. Detectives refused to make promises. Cold case investigations have disappointed families too many times. Instead, they explained only that science continued advancing. Work continued. Evidence continued speaking. The answers might exist. No one knew how close they truly were. Behind the scenes, investigators gradually began seeing something they had never possessed before. Not a suspect. Not yet. But a direction. The genealogy work suggested that the unknown DNA profile belonged to someone connected to a particular extended family. It was the first meaningful movement in decades. For nearly 40 years, every investigative path had eventually ended. This one kept going. The family tree expanded backward through generations, then outward through siblings, cousins, marriages, and descendants. Researchers examined historical records stretching across multiple states. Every document had to be verified. Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, military service records, property records, obituaries, yearbooks. Every source helped place individuals inside an enormous genealogical puzzle. Detectives watched the list gradually shrink. Hundreds of possible relatives became dozens. Dozens slowly became only a handful of men whose ages, locations, and life histories deserved closer examination. For the first time since 1973, investigators could almost sense that the mystery surrounding Linda O'Keefe's murder was beginning to crack. They still lacked definitive proof. They still lacked the one piece of evidence necessary to make an arrest. But after decades of silence, the investigation had finally begun moving forward, not because someone confessed, not because a witness suddenly remembered, but because science had learned to hear a story hidden inside DNA that generations of detectives had preserved with unwavering faith, believing that someday, somehow, the evidence would finally reveal the name it had been protecting for nearly half a century. If the offender's profile exists nowhere within available databases, investigators still face a difficult problem. They know someone committed the crime. They simply cannot determine whose DNA they are observing. That became another frustrating obstacle. Law enforcement databases expanded steadily during these years, collecting DNA from convicted offenders under changing state and federal laws. Every expansion increased the likelihood that unknown profiles from unsolved crimes might eventually find matches. Detectives waited. Months became years. Database searches continued. No match appeared. The absence of a match suggested several possibilities. Perhaps the offender had never been arrested for qualifying crimes. Perhaps he lived outside jurisdictions contributing DNA records. Perhaps he had died before databases became widespread. Or perhaps his sample simply had never been collected. Every possibility remained plausible. Investigators refused to interpret silence as failure. Instead, they viewed it as another stage in a longer process. Technology continued evolving. Laboratories became more sensitive. Smaller quantities of biological material yielded increasingly reliable results. Procedures unimaginable during the early years of the investigation gradually became standard forensic practice. The evidence itself seemed almost timeless. Collected in 1973, tested repeatedly across changing generations of science. Each decade extracting slightly more information than the last. Yet one essential question remained unanswered. Who had left that DNA behind? Outside forensic laboratories, Linda's family continued carrying unimaginable patience. Nearly every homicide victim's family shares one common hope. Not revenge. Answers. To know what happened. To know who was responsible. To know that the person who destroyed their family cannot simply disappear into history. Year after year, those answers remained beyond reach. Detectives responsible for communicating with the family understood the emotional burden created by every new scientific advance. Each announcement about improved DNA technology raised expectations. Could this finally be the breakthrough? Could this finally end decades of uncertainty? Sometimes investigators had to deliver disappointing news. Testing had been completed. No identification. Not yet. Those conversations never became easier. The file itself continued expanding. Original reports from 1973 now rested beside modern forensic analyses produced decades later. Different generations of detectives added observations, diagrams, laboratory results, and investigative summaries. The case became a living historical record reflecting nearly 30 years of persistence. Few investigations survive with such continuity. Many lose evidence. Many lose documentation. Some become impossible to reconstruct after decades. Linda's case avoided those dangers because countless investigators treated every piece of information with exceptional care. They understood that future detectives would depend upon their work. That foresight preserved opportunities still invisible at the time. By the end of the 20th century, the investigation occupied a unique position. It was no longer merely an old unsolved homicide. It had become a scientifically viable cold case. The evidence existed. The DNA profile existed. What investigators lacked was a name. That distinction mattered enormously. For decades, the case had suffered from insufficient technology. Now it suffered from insufficient comparison. It was a fundamentally different problem. One science was rapidly beginning to solve. Around the country, forensic experts started discussing entirely new possibilities involving genetic genealogy, an emerging concept that suggested DNA might identify unknown individuals even when their own profiles never entered criminal databases. At first, the idea sounded almost unbelievable. Instead of searching only for exact matches, investigators might someday identify distant relatives, reconstruct family trees, and gradually narrow unknown suspects through genealogy. During those early discussions, few could predict how revolutionary the method would become. Some scientists viewed it cautiously. Others believed it represented the future of cold case investigations. Detectives watched with growing interest. If successful, such techniques might solve cases once considered permanently beyond reach. Among the thousands of unsolved homicides scattered across America, Linda O'Keefe's murder remained quietly waiting. Its evidence had survived. Its DNA profile had survived. Its investigators had refused to surrender. All that remained was the scientific breakthrough capable of connecting one anonymous genetic profile to the man who had spent decades believing history had buried his crime forever. By the time the investigation entered its fifth decade, the atmosphere inside the Orange County Sheriff's Department had changed. The optimism was cautious, almost restrained, but it was unmistakably different from the frustration that had defined the case for so many years. Detectives had learned not to celebrate possibilities. Cold cases had a way of offering hope before collapsing under closer examination. Yet this time, the investigation was moving in a direction no previous detective had ever been able to follow. The DNA was no longer just anonymous biological evidence. It was beginning to point toward a family. Not a name. Not yet. But a family. Genealogists continued building an intricate network of relatives connected through generations of births, marriages, and descendants. Every discovery narrowed the search. A distant cousin identified through shared DNA led to grandparents. Grandparents led to siblings. Siblings led to children. Entire branches of the family tree were reconstructed with painstaking precision, eliminating impossible candidates while preserving every plausible one. Yet the work demanded extraordinary patience. There were no dramatic interrogations, no high-speed pursuits, no anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Instead, investigators spent countless hours studying public records, comparing timelines, and asking one deceptively simple question. Who, among all these relatives, could have been in Southern California in July of 1973? That single question eliminated dozens of names. Some individuals had been children. Others had not yet been born. Many lived thousands of miles away. Some had documented military assignments or employment records placing them elsewhere when Linda disappeared. Slowly, methodically, the enormous family tree became smaller. The investigation was no longer searching through millions of people. It was searching through a manageable list. Each remaining individual required careful examination. Detectives studied employment histories, residential addresses, marriage records, military service, criminal histories, vehicle ownership, any detail that could place or exclude a person from Newport Beach during the summer of 1973. And one name repeatedly refused to disappear: a James Allen Neal. Unlike many others who had been eliminated through documentation, Neal's life history raised questions investigators could not ignore. And he had lived in California during the relevant period. His age aligned with witness descriptions of the offender. His movements during the early 1970s appeared consistent with someone capable of being in Orange County when Linda vanished. And none of this proved guilt. Not even close. A genealogy had done its job. It had pointed investigators toward a possible family connection. Now traditional police work had to take over. Detectives knew they were entering the most delicate phase of the investigation. If Neil was innocent, every assumption had to be challenged. If he was guilty, every piece of evidence had to withstand scrutiny in court. Speculation had no value. Only facts mattered. Investigators quietly assembled everything they could learn about him. Born years before Linda's murder, Neil had lived a life that, from the outside, appeared remarkably ordinary. Friends and acquaintances described a man who blended into everyday society. He worked. He moved between communities. He interacted with neighbors. Nothing immediately distinguished him from thousands of other men living in California during the 1970s. But that ordinary appearance deeply unsettled investigators. One of the most difficult realities in homicide investigations is that violent offenders often appear completely unremarkable. There is rarely a sign announcing danger. Neighbors remember polite conversations. Co-workers describe dependable employees. Communities struggle to reconcile ordinary public behavior with horrific private actions. Detectives understood that appearance alone could neither condemn nor clear anyone. Evidence had to speak. The investigative team expanded its review. They searched for any previous contact Neil might have had with law enforcement. Held reports, traffic citations, employment records, addresses near schools. Everything was documented. Patterns slowly began to emerge, not dramatic revelations, but enough information to justify continued investigation. Still, one obstacle remained. The genealogy evidence itself could not establish guilt. It merely suggested that investigators had identified someone worthy of closer examination. They still needed direct forensic confirmation. They needed Neil's DNA. Without it, decades of investigative work could collapse. Obtaining that DNA required patience and absolute secrecy. If investigators approached Neil too early, they risked alerting him before sufficient evidence existed. If they waited too long, opportunities might disappear. Surveillance teams quietly monitored his activities. Every movement was conducted lawfully and carefully documented. Experienced investigators know that people leave DNA almost everywhere they go. A drinking cup, a discarded napkin, a cigarette, a utensil, an item thrown into public trash. Objects most people never think about can become crucial evidence when handled correctly. The challenge was obtaining a sample that unquestionably originated from Neil without violating legal standards. Every step required coordination. Every decision required legal review. The investigation had survived more than 40 years. No one intended to jeopardize it through unnecessary mistakes. Meanwhile, those outside the investigation knew nothing. Linda's family continued living their daily lives unaware that, behind closed doors, detectives might be closer than anyone had ever been to identifying the man responsible for their daughter's murder. Yet the secrecy protected the integrity of the investigation. Premature publicity could influence witnesses. It could affect future legal proceedings. Most importantly, it could give a potential suspect an opportunity to destroy evidence or disappear. The detectives carried the burden alone. They understood that history was watching. Cold case prosecutions present unique challenges. Defense attorneys naturally question memories after decades. Witnesses may no longer be alive. Physical locations change. Evidence must withstand extraordinary scrutiny because so much time has passed. Every conclusion, therefore, required overwhelming support. No shortcuts. No assumptions. Only verifiable facts. Investigators also revisited every original witness statement from 1973. Could Neil's appearance be compared with the composite sketches? Did his known vehicles resemble witness descriptions? Had he lived or worked near any relevant locations? Some details aligned more closely than investigators expected. Others remained inconclusive. The evidence was beginning to form a coherent picture, but detectives refused to force pieces together simply because they wanted answers. Confirmation bias has ended many investigations. Experienced homicide detectives constantly challenge their own theories. Could someone else fit the evidence better? Was another family branch overlooked? Could the genealogy have pointed toward the wrong individual? Every alternative had to be considered before moving forward. The scientific team continued refining the DNA work. Technology had advanced dramatically since the earliest analyses. Profiles that once seemed incomplete could now provide extraordinary precision. Laboratories followed rigorous quality control procedures, understanding that every result might eventually be presented before a jury. There was no room for uncertainty. Eventually, investigators succeeded in obtaining a DNA sample believed to belong to James Allen Neal through lawful investigative means. The moment marked one of the most significant turning points in the history of the case. For decades, detectives had possessed two separate pieces of the puzzle: an unknown DNA profile from the crime scene, a growing list of possible suspects. Now, for the first time, they could directly compare one against the other. The laboratory process itself offered no drama. Scientists worked quietly behind secured doors. Machines analyzed genetic markers. Quality checks were repeated. Independent verification ensured accuracy. Outside the laboratory, detectives waited. Some had devoted years of their careers to the investigation. Others had inherited the case from retired colleagues who never lived to see this moment. Everyone understood what the results might mean. If the DNA excluded Neal, the investigation would return to uncertainty. The genealogy work would have to begin again. Another family. Another tree. Another search. If the DNA matched, everything would change. Days passed. Then came the answer investigators had pursued since the summer of 1973. The DNA profile obtained from James Allen Neal matched the biological evidence preserved from Linda O'Keefe's murder. After nearly half a century, the anonymous genetic profile finally had a name. For many detectives, the result was almost surreal. As some sat silently reading the laboratory report, others immediately began reviewing decades of evidence through an entirely new lens. The investigation that had once consisted of endless unanswered questions suddenly possessed a living suspect connected directly by forensic science. But the work was not finished. A DNA match, while extraordinarily powerful, represented one component of a complete criminal case. Investigators immediately began strengthening every aspect of their evidence: timelines, witness statements, historical records, travel patterns. Everything had to demonstrate that James Allen Neal was not merely genetically connected to evidence, but that he had the opportunity and circumstances consistent with committing the crime. The prosecution would eventually need to explain not only who the offender was, but how investigators reached that conclusion after 45 years. Every step of the genealogy process was documented. Every laboratory procedure preserved. Every investigative decision recorded. Transparency would be essential. The detectives finally allowed themselves a quiet realization they had resisted for decades. The Linda O'Keefe case was no longer simply a cold case. It had become an active homicide investigation once again. For Linda's family, however, that truth had not yet arrived. They still woke each morning believing the mystery remained unsolved, unaware that somewhere inside a forensic laboratory report, hidden among columns of genetic markers and scientific terminology, lay the answer that generations of detectives had spent nearly 50 years searching for: a single DNA comparison that had finally transformed one of California's oldest unsolved child murders into a case on the verge of justice. For 45 years, the investigation into Linda O'Keefe's murder had been defined by one word: unknown. Unknown offender, unknown identity, unknown motive. Every detective who inherited the case accepted the same burden, hoping they might become the one to replace that single word with a name. When the laboratory confirmed that the DNA recovered from the preserved evidence matched James Allen Neal, the investigation crossed an invisible line. The mystery of who had left the biological evidence was no longer the central question. Now detectives faced another challenge just as critical: building a case capable of surviving the scrutiny of a courtroom nearly half a century after the crime. No arrest was made immediately. That decision reflected strategy, not hesitation. Experienced investigators understood that once a suspect realizes law enforcement has identified him, every future conversation, every movement, every opportunity to gather additional evidence changes forever. Detectives wanted to ensure that every piece of the investigation was complete before taking the next step. The DNA evidence was extraordinary. But it would never stand alone. Prosecutors would eventually need to explain the entire story from Linda's disappearance on July 6, 1973, to the scientific advances that finally revealed the identity of the man investigators believed had murdered her. Every link in that chain had to be documented with precision. Detectives returned once again to the original case file. Boxes that had been opened dozens of times over the years were reopened. Witness statements were reviewed line by line. Old photographs were examined using modern imaging technology. Historical maps of Newport Beach were compared with current records. Addresses connected to James Allen Neal were plotted alongside locations important to the investigation. Patterns that once seemed impossible to evaluate suddenly became meaningful. Investigators examined where Neal had lived, where he had worked, how he traveled, whether he had access to vehicles similar to those described by witnesses in 1973. Every answer helped strengthen or challenge the growing case against him. Nothing was accepted simply because the DNA pointed in one direction. Good investigators constantly test their own conclusions. Could the biological evidence have been contaminated? Laboratories reviewed every handling procedure. Could someone else related to Neal have been responsible? The genealogy team revisited the family tree to eliminate that possibility. Could innocent contact somehow explain the DNA? The circumstances of the crime made such explanations extraordinarily unlikely. Each question was asked because prosecutors knew defense attorneys would eventually ask the same ones. The stronger the investigation became before an arrest, the stronger it would remain afterward. As detectives worked quietly behind the scenes, James Allen Neal continued living his daily life. There was no indication that he knew investigators had identified him. To neighbors and acquaintances, life appeared ordinary. Routine continued. Conversations continued. Errands continued. Yet, unknown to him, nearly 50 years of scientific progress had finally caught up with evidence left behind on a summer afternoon in 1973. For investigators, the emotional weight of that realization was difficult to ignore. Many cold cases never reach this point. Evidence deteriorates. Records disappear. Witnesses die. Families lose hope. Linda's case had survived because generation after generation of detectives refused to give up. Every investigator who preserved evidence. Every evidence technician who carefully documented a transfer. Every laboratory scientist who protected fragile biological material. Every detective who resisted closing the file despite decades without progress. Their combined work had made this moment possible. The investigation now entered one of its most carefully planned phases. Senior investigators met with prosecutors from the Orange County District Attorney's Office. The evidence was reviewed collectively. Legal strategy became just as important as investigative strategy. How should the genealogy process be explained? How should decades of scientific development be presented to a jury unfamiliar with advanced DNA analysis? How could prosecutors demonstrate that modern forensic methods remained reliable despite the age of the evidence? These discussions were essential. The science itself had to be understandable. Jurors would eventually need confidence not only in the laboratory results but also in the investigative journey that produced them. Meanwhile, detectives quietly prepared to notify Linda's surviving family. That conversation carried enormous emotional significance. Families waiting decades for answers often experience conflicting emotions when an investigation suddenly reaches a breakthrough. Relief, disbelief, grief renewed, hope, anger, all can arrive at once. Investigators carefully planned how the information would be shared. No family should learn news of such importance through television reports or newspaper headlines. They deserve to hear it directly. Before that meeting occurred, detectives continued strengthening every possible aspect of the case. Historical employment records were verified. Travel histories were reconstructed where possible. Investigators searched for any additional crimes that might reveal behavioral similarities. James Allen Neal's background was examined extensively. Every documented interaction with law enforcement received attention. The objective was not to build character evidence. It was to understand whether other information existed that could illuminate the events surrounding Linda's murder. At the same time, forensic experts independently confirmed the DNA findings. Scientific replication is a cornerstone of reliable forensic practice. One laboratory result is powerful. Independent confirmation strengthens confidence even further. The conclusions remained consistent. The DNA matched. The evidence collected in 1973 belonged to James Allen Neal. For detectives who had spent years immersed in the case, the laboratory reports carried profound emotional impact despite their technical language. Columns of numbers. Genetic markers. Probability calculations. To most people, they appeared almost unreadable. To investigators, they represented the voice of evidence speaking across 45 years. Unlike memories, DNA does not forget. Unlike witnesses, it does not age. It simply exists, waiting until science becomes capable of understanding it. That realization transformed the atmosphere surrounding the investigation. The case no longer revolved around whether it could be solved. It revolved around bringing the identified suspect before the justice system. Yet another challenge remained: time itself. James Allen Neal was now an elderly man. Nearly half a century had passed since Linda's murder. Age does not erase criminal responsibility, but it changes practical realities. Health concerns had to be considered. Logistics became more complicated. Investigators understood that delaying action unnecessarily carried risks. Every day mattered. Even so, they refused to sacrifice thoroughness for speed. The case had waited decades. It could wait long enough to ensure every legal requirement was satisfied. News of the investigation remained tightly controlled. Only those directly involved understood how close the case had come to resolution. Outside law enforcement, Linda's murder continued to be viewed as one of California's oldest unsolved child homicides. The public had no idea that detectives were preparing to reveal one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in Orange County history. Inside the investigative team, however, the emotional atmosphere had begun changing. Some detectives found themselves thinking about colleagues who had worked the case years earlier. Many of those original investigators had long since retired. Some had died without knowing the mystery would one day be solved. Their notes remained inside the file. Their interviews continued contributing to the investigation. Although they would never witness the final outcome, their work remained present in every page reviewed by the modern team. Cold case investigations often span multiple careers. Justice becomes a relay rather than a sprint. One generation preserves evidence. Another develops new scientific methods. A third finally reaches the truth. The Linda O'Keefe investigation embodied that reality perfectly. No single detective solved the case alone. It was solved through decades of persistence shared across countless investigators, scientists, analysts, prosecutors, and evidence technicians. Each played a role. Each protected the possibility that someday science would answer questions human memory never could. As preparations for an arrest continued, investigators reflected on the extraordinary path the case had taken. In 1973, DNA profiling did not exist. Computers capable of organizing enormous investigative databases barely existed. Genetic genealogy was unimaginable. Had any link in the chain failed, had evidence been discarded, contaminated, or forgotten, the opportunity now before investigators would have disappeared forever. Instead, because the evidence survived, so did the truth. It had remained hidden in microscopic genetic material for nearly 50 years, invisible to every detective who handled the file until technology advanced enough to reveal it. Now at last, the investigation stood on the threshold of the moment Linda's family had waited almost a lifetime to hear. The announcement that the unknown killer was unknown no longer, and that the pursuit of justice, delayed for decades but never abandoned, was finally entering its final chapter. The breakthrough that investigators had spent decades pursuing was no longer confined to laboratory reports and sealed evidence envelopes. It had reached the point where decisions carried consequences that could never be undone. Every meeting inside the Orange County District Attorney's Office revolved around the same objective: ensure that when the case became public, every question could be answered with evidence, every conclusion supported by facts, and every investigative step capable of withstanding the highest level of legal scrutiny. For nearly half a century, Linda O'Keefe's name had appeared alongside one phrase that seemed impossible to erase: cold case. Now detectives were preparing to remove those words forever. The first people who needed to know were Linda's surviving family members. No press conference. No television cameras. No public announcement. Investigators believed the family deserved to hear the news privately before the rest of the world learned that the mystery surrounding Linda's murder had finally been unraveled. When detectives met with them, the conversation carried an emotional weight few people outside law enforcement ever witness. There are moments in a homicide investigation that no amount of training can make routine. Informing parents or siblings that a loved one has died is one. Returning decades later to explain that the person responsible has finally been identified is another entirely. For the O'Keefe family, nearly 45 years had passed since Linda left swim practice and never returned home. Children had grown into adults. Parents had grown old. Entire chapters of life had unfolded while one question remained unanswered. Who did this? Now investigators had an answer supported by modern forensic science. Relief did not erase grief. Justice, even when it finally arrives, cannot restore the years that were taken. It cannot return birthdays that were never celebrated. It cannot replace family photographs that were never taken. It cannot rewrite history. What it can do is end uncertainty. For families of homicide victims, uncertainty often becomes its own lifelong burden. The family listened as detectives carefully explained how the investigation had evolved over decades. They described the preservation of evidence, the development of DNA technology, the emergence of forensic genetic genealogy, the painstaking reconstruction of family trees, and finally, the DNA comparison that identified James Allen Neal. This was not a sudden miracle. It was the result of thousands of hours of work performed by generations of investigators who had refused to let Linda's case disappear into history. The emotional impact extended beyond the family. Within the sheriff's department, detectives who had inherited the case from earlier investigators reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. Some remembered opening Linda's file for the first time years earlier, wondering whether they would ever accomplish what so many before them could not. Others thought about retired detectives whose handwritten notes still filled the investigation. Those detectives had searched neighborhoods without DNA, interviewed witnesses without computers, preserved evidence without knowing exactly why future science might need it. Their decisions had become the foundation upon which the modern investigation stood. Soon afterward, investigators moved toward the next critical step. James Allen Neal was taken into custody. For law enforcement, the arrest represented the culmination of nearly 5 decades of investigative persistence. For the public, however, the announcement came as a profound shock. News organizations across California quickly reported that one of Orange County's oldest unsolved child murders had finally been solved. The headlines echoed across television broadcasts, newspapers, and digital media. 45-year-old cold case solved through DNA. Suspect arrested in 1973, murder of Linda O'Keefe. Genetic genealogy leads detectives to breakthrough after decades. Communities that had long believed the mystery would remain unsolved suddenly found themselves confronting a completely different reality. The man investigators accused of murdering Linda had lived among ordinary people for decades. He had grown older, worked jobs, built relationships, passed unnoticed through everyday life. To many observers, that realization proved almost as unsettling as the crime itself. It reinforced a difficult truth. Time does not erase responsibility. A person may avoid identification for years, even decades, but preserved evidence has a remarkable ability to outlast the passage of time. During public announcements, investigators emphasized exactly that point. The success of the case belonged not only to modern DNA science, but also to the original detectives who had protected evidence collected in 1973. Had that evidence been discarded under the assumption it would never become useful, the investigation would likely have remained unsolved forever. The announcement also highlighted the expanding role of forensic genetic genealogy. Only a few years earlier, many outside law enforcement had never heard the term. Now it had become one of the most powerful tools available for solving violent crimes committed long before DNA databases existed. Investigators were careful to explain that genealogy alone had not solved the case. It generated investigative leads. Traditional police work confirmed those leads. Finally, direct DNA comparison established the forensic connection. Each step depended upon the others. Science and detective work had functioned together rather than separately. As media coverage intensified, reporters revisited Linda's life. Photographs taken before her death appeared once again across newspapers and television screens. The smiling 11-year-old whose story had faded from national attention returned to the public consciousness. Many younger viewers encountered the case for the first time. Older residents of Southern California remembered it instantly. Some recalled joining search efforts in 1973. Others remembered parents warning children never to walk home alone after Linda disappeared. The case had shaped an entire generation's understanding of personal safety. Now it was shaping public understanding of forensic science. Experts from across the country pointed to the investigation as an example of why cold cases should never be abandoned. Evidence that appears silent today may speak tomorrow. Science does not stand still. Every year brings methods that previous generations could scarcely imagine. For homicide investigators nationwide, the Linda O'Keefe case became another reminder that patience can be as important as persistence. Not every case can be solved immediately. Some require decades. Some require entirely new scientific disciplines. Some simply require someone willing to preserve evidence long enough for the future to arrive. Inside court filings, prosecutors carefully outline the scientific basis supporting the charges. The evidence presented a compelling narrative built upon decades of investigative work. The biological evidence recovered in 1973, its preservation, the DNA profile, the genealogy research, the lawful acquisition of Neil's DNA, the laboratory comparison confirming the match. Every stage documented, every stage reviewable, every stage intended to withstand legal examination. Yet despite the remarkable breakthrough, investigators remained mindful of one fundamental principle. An arrest is not a conviction. The criminal justice system requires that evidence be tested openly before a court. The prosecution still carried the burden of proving its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Detectives welcomed that scrutiny. After nearly half a century of investigation, they believed the evidence deserved to be examined in full. As preparations for future court proceedings continued, one truth became increasingly clear. The Linda O'Keefe investigation had already changed the landscape of cold case investigations regardless of its legal outcome. It demonstrated that evidence collected by determined detectives in one era could combine with scientific discoveries from another to solve crimes once believed permanently beyond reach. It reminded law enforcement agencies everywhere of the importance of preserving every possible piece of evidence. Most importantly, it offered hope to thousands of families still waiting for answers. Somewhere inside evidence rooms across the world, other unsolved cases continued waiting exactly as Linda's had waited. Boxes, photographs, biological samples, silent witnesses protected for years by people who believed that one day science might finally give them a voice. For Linda O'Keefe's family, that day had finally come. After nearly 50 years of unanswered questions, investigators had spoken the words they feared might never be possible. The mystery was no longer who. Now the justice system would determine the final outcome of a story that had begun on a quiet summer morning in Newport Beach, a story that proves some crimes may remain hidden for generations, but the truth, preserved with patience and uncovered through science, can endure far longer than the silence that once surrounded it. The announcement that James Allen Neal had been identified as the suspect in Linda O'Keefe's murder marked the end of one chapter, but it did not erase nearly half a century of unanswered questions. For investigators, solving a cold case is never simply about identifying a suspect. It is about reconstructing history with enough clarity that events separated by decades can still withstand the careful examination of a court of law. Every document, every photograph, every witness statement collected since July 1973 suddenly became part of a much larger story, one that prosecutors now had to present as a coherent narrative built entirely on verified evidence. As preparations for court proceedings continued, detectives once again immersed themselves in the original investigation. The route Linda had walked after leaving swim practice. The witness statements describing a suspicious vehicle. The timeline established on the day she disappeared. The location where her body was discovered. Nothing was considered too minor to review. In modern homicide investigations, investigators often rely on digital records, surveillance footage, mobile phone data, GPS locations, and electronic communications. None of those resources existed in 1973. Every conclusion had been built from patient interviews, handwritten reports, physical evidence, and careful observation. That reality became one of the defining characteristics of the case. It illustrated how dramatically criminal investigations had changed over 5 decades. The prosecution's case would depend on demonstrating that although investigative methods had evolved, the evidence itself had remained reliable. Biological evidence collected in 1973 had been preserved according to procedures that protected its integrity. Every transfer between evidence custodians had been documented. Every forensic examination had been recorded. The chain of custody stretched across generations of investigators, creating an unbroken record that allowed modern scientists to confidently analyze material collected decades earlier. That meticulous documentation became almost as important as the DNA itself. Without it, defense attorneys could reasonably question whether evidence had been altered or contaminated over the years. Instead, investigators were able to demonstrate extraordinary continuity. If the evidence had remained secure, the science had changed. The evidence had not. Meanwhile, news organizations across the country examined another aspect of the investigation that fascinated both law enforcement professionals and the public alike: forensic genetic genealogy. Until only a few years earlier, the technique had been virtually unknown outside specialized scientific communities. Now it had entered mainstream discussion because of several remarkable cold case breakthroughs. Experts carefully explained what the technology actually accomplished. Contrary to popular belief, genealogy databases do not simply reveal the identity of unknown offenders. Instead, they identify biological relationships: a distant cousin, a shared ancestor, and a family branch. From there, traditional detective work begins. Researchers build family trees. Investigators compare ages, geographic locations, historical records. Eventually, a list of possibilities becomes small enough that conventional forensic testing can determine whether one individual matches the crime scene DNA. The Linda O'Keefe investigation followed precisely that path. Genealogy pointed investigators toward a family. Detective work narrowed the search. Direct DNA comparison provided the forensic confirmation. Each stage depended upon the others. None alone would have solved the case. The investigation quickly became an important example studied by homicide detectives nationwide. Police agencies responsible for other unsolved murders contacted experts involved in the case, hoping to understand whether similar approaches might finally unlock mysteries within their own jurisdictions. Evidence rooms across America suddenly took on renewed significance. Cases untouched for decades were reopened. Old biological evidence was inventoried. Investigators began asking the same question Orange County detectives had asked years earlier. What if the answer has been waiting here all along? For Linda's family, however, the case remained deeply personal. Public attention focused on scientific breakthroughs and investigative techniques. The family remembered a daughter, a sister, an 11-year-old girl who had left home expecting to return after swim practice. The passage of time had never diminished that loss. Interviews given by family members reflected both gratitude and sorrow. They expressed appreciation for the detectives who refused to abandon the investigation. At the same time, they acknowledged an undeniable truth. Justice delayed for decades can never replace the years that were stolen. Every birthday missed. Every holiday marked by absence. Every family milestone Linda never experienced. No investigation, regardless of its success, could restore those moments. That perspective became one of the most powerful reminders surrounding the case. Cold case investigations matter not because they reverse tragedy. They matter because they affirm that victims are not forgotten, that society continues searching for truth even after headlines disappear. That time does not reduce the value of justice. Within law enforcement circles, another lesson emerged. Evidence preservation saves cases. In 1973, no investigator could have anticipated the development of forensic genetic genealogy. No one could have imagined the computing power that future laboratories would possess. Yet detectives protected biological evidence anyway, not because they knew exactly how it would be used, because they believed future science might reveal something current science could not. That philosophy has since become central to modern cold case investigations. Preserve everything. Document everything. Never assume today's limitations will remain tomorrow's. As legal proceedings move forward, experts prepared to explain complex scientific concepts in language understandable to jurors. DNA analysis often appears intimidating because of its technical vocabulary. Genetic markers, alleles, probability calculations, laboratory protocols. Yet the fundamental principle is remarkably straightforward. Every individual possesses a unique genetic profile, inherited from biological parents. When investigators recover DNA from crime scene evidence, that profile can be compared against another sample. If the profiles match under validated scientific standards, the probability of coincidence becomes extraordinarily small. Jurors would ultimately evaluate those scientific findings alongside every other piece of evidence presented. Investigators welcomed that process. The case had been built patiently and methodically over nearly 50 years. They believed it could withstand careful examination. As the story spread internationally, commentators observed how dramatically the relationship between science and criminal justice had evolved. In 1973, investigators depended primarily upon eyewitnesses. Today, microscopic biological traces can identify offenders decades after a crime occurred. Future generations will almost certainly develop investigative methods that appear equally unimaginable today. The Linda O'Keefe investigation therefore represented more than one solved homicide. It demonstrated the continuing evolution of forensic science itself. The case also carried a message for families still waiting for answers in other unsolved investigations. Many contacted law enforcement agencies after hearing about Linda's case. Some asked whether preserved evidence from their loved one's investigation might also benefit from modern DNA analysis. Others simply found hope, not certainty. Hope. Hope that unanswered questions need not remain unanswered forever. For detectives, perhaps the most meaningful outcome extended beyond any single arrest. The investigation reaffirmed a professional commitment shared across homicide units everywhere. No case is forgotten simply because it becomes old. A file placed inside storage is not abandoned. It waits. Waiting is not surrender. Waiting sometimes means allowing science enough time to catch up with the evidence. Looking back across nearly half a century, the path from July 1973 to the identification of James Allen Neal seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Thousands of interviews, generations of investigators, advances in forensic biology, the emergence of genetic genealogy, the careful preservation of evidence. None alone would have solved the case. Together, they transformed one of California's longest-running mysteries into one of its most significant cold case breakthroughs. The story of Linda O'Keefe ultimately became more than a story about a crime. It became a story about persistence, about the quiet determination of investigators who refused to close a file simply because decades had passed, about scientists who expanded the boundaries of what evidence could reveal, about a family that endured unimaginable uncertainty while never losing hope that the truth still existed. And above all, it became a reminder that although time can hide the identity of a killer, it cannot erase the evidence left behind. And when that evidence is preserved with care, the truth may wait patiently for years, even generations, until the day science is finally ready to uncover it. Nearly half a century separated the crime from the breakthrough, but the passage of time never diminished one uncomfortable question that continued to echo throughout the investigation. How had someone allegedly responsible for one of Southern California's most notorious child murders managed to remain unidentified for so long? It was a question investigators examined carefully, not because it changed the evidence, but because understanding the answer could help prevent similar cases from remaining unsolved in the future. The simplest explanation was also the most accurate. The technology needed to identify the offender did not exist in 1973. Detectives working the original investigation did not fail because they lacked determination, By every available account, they pursued the case relentlessly. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, followed thousands of leads, examined physical evidence with the best forensic methods available, and coordinated with neighboring law enforcement agencies. Their investigation reflected the highest standards of the era. What they lacked was not effort. They lacked the scientific tools that future generations would eventually take for granted. That distinction matters because history sometimes judges old investigations unfairly through the lens of modern technology. Today, investigators routinely compare DNA profiles within ours. Surveillance cameras document countless public spaces. Cell phones record movements. License plate readers monitor traffic. Digital records allow detectives to reconstruct timelines with extraordinary precision. None of those investigative resources existed on the day Linda disappeared. The detectives in 1973 relied almost entirely upon human observation, human memory, physical evidence, and patience. Their ability to preserve crucial evidence despite those limitations became one of the defining reasons the case was ultimately solved. As forensic experts later explained, the biological evidence collected during the original investigation remained remarkably valuable because it had been carefully protected. Evidence technicians followed procedures that prevented unnecessary contamination. Detectives documented every transfer. Laboratory personnel maintained detailed records. Those seemingly routine administrative decisions became priceless decades later. Inside evidence rooms, discipline often appears invisible. There are no dramatic headlines celebrating properly labeled envelopes or carefully completed chain of custody forms. Yet those quiet acts of professionalism frequently determine whether justice remains possible years later. Linda O'Keefe's case demonstrated that principle with extraordinary clarity. The investigation also reshaped conversations about the future of cold case work. Police departments across the United States began reassessing long unsolved investigations involving preserved biological evidence. Cases once considered dormant suddenly appeared worthy of renewed attention. Investigators asked new questions. Has this evidence ever undergone modern DNA testing? Could forensic genealogy provide new investigative leads? Has laboratory technology improved since the last examination? Those questions opened opportunities that had not existed only a decade earlier. The success of several genealogy-assisted investigations encouraged agencies to establish specialized cold case units dedicated entirely to reviewing older homicides. Instead of viewing time as an obstacle, detectives increasingly viewed preserved evidence as a resource waiting for improved science. That philosophical shift represented one of the most important legacies of Linda O'Keefe's case. The investigation influenced more than one prosecution. It influenced investigative thinking itself. Meanwhile, criminologists studying solved cold cases observed another recurring pattern. Violent offenders often assume that surviving the first years after a crime dramatically reduces the likelihood of arrest. Historically, that belief contains some truth. Witness memories fade. Physical evidence deteriorates. Public attention shifts elsewhere. Yet DNA fundamentally altered that equation. Unlike memories, genetic evidence does not become less unique over time. If preserved correctly, it can remain scientifically valuable for decades. As laboratory methods improve, old evidence often becomes more useful rather than less. That reversal has transformed the psychology of cold case investigations. Time no longer benefits offenders in quite the same way it once did. Every year may instead bring better technology, more comprehensive databases, more sophisticated analytical methods, more opportunities for identification. The Linda O'Keefe investigation became a compelling illustration of that transformation. For the public, however, the story remained deeply emotional. Scientific breakthroughs captured headlines, but people continued returning to the image of an 11-year-old girl walking home from swim practice on a warm July afternoon. The simplicity of her routine made the tragedy profoundly unsettling. She was not engaged in dangerous activity. She was following a familiar path through a community widely regarded as safe. That ordinary setting challenged long-held assumptions about security and trust. Parents who remembered the summer of 1973 often described lasting changes in how they raised their children afterward. Walking alone became less common. Neighborhood awareness increased. Schools strengthen safety education. While no single case created those broader societal changes, Linda's murder became one of several tragedies that profoundly influenced public attitudes toward child safety during that era. As the investigation gained renewed attention, historians and criminal justice experts reflected upon another remarkable aspect of the case. It represented cooperation across generations. The detectives who first processed the crime scene could never have anticipated forensic genealogy. The scientists developing DNA analysis decades later had never met Linda. The prosecutors preparing the eventual case inherited work begun long before many of them entered law school. Each generation contributed something essential. Without the original investigators, there would have been no preserved evidence. Without forensic scientists, the DNA could not have been interpreted. Without genealogists, investigators might never have identified the suspect. Without modern detectives, those scientific discoveries could never have been transformed into a criminal investigation. Justice emerged not from one extraordinary individual, but from decades of collective persistence. That realization resonated deeply within law enforcement. Cold case work often receives less public attention than active investigations. It unfolds quietly, patiently, without immediate results. Yet cases like Linda's demonstrate why that work remains indispensable. Every preserved file represents unfinished responsibility. Every evidence box contains unanswered questions. Some may never be solved. Others may simply be waiting for tomorrow's technology. Educational institutions also began referencing the investigation when teaching forensic science and criminal investigation. Students examined how evolving laboratory methods changed investigative possibilities. Legal scholars explored the evidentiary standards surrounding forensic genealogy. Ethicists discussed privacy considerations associated with genealogical databases. The case therefore extended beyond criminal justice into broader conversations about science, technology, and society. Its influence reached classrooms as well as courtrooms. For Linda's family, however, those broader discussions remained secondary. Their focus never shifted from the young girl whose future ended in 1973. Every public conversation about DNA technology ultimately returned to her memory. Investigators consistently emphasized that point during interviews. The science mattered because it served the victim. The technology mattered because it answered a question left unresolved for decades. Without Linda's story, there would have been no investigation to solve. As months passed following the public announcement, many people found themselves revisiting newspaper archives and television reports from the original investigation. The contrast proved striking. Black and white photographs from 1973 sat beside modern forensic graphics explaining DNA analysis. Hand-drawn investigative maps appeared alongside digital reconstructions. The evolution of criminal investigation unfolded almost visually across half a century. Few cases illustrated that progression so clearly. Looking back, one realization became impossible to ignore. The evidence had never stopped telling the truth. It simply spoke a language investigators could not yet understand. For decades, the biological material collected from the crime scene contained the identity of the person who left it. The information was always there. Hidden. Silent. Waiting. Science eventually learned how to listen. That lesson reached far beyond one investigation. It reminded detectives everywhere that evidence should never be underestimated simply because contemporary technology cannot fully explain it. Today's mystery may become tomorrow's certainty. Today's unanswered question may become tomorrow's scientific demonstration. Linda O'Keefe's case stood as living proof of that principle. It showed that persistence is measured not only in hours worked or interviews conducted, but also in the willingness to preserve hope across generations to protect evidence, maintain records, and believe that someday, even if decades must pass, the truth hidden inside the smallest fragment of biological evidence can finally emerge into the light, carrying with it the answers that an entire community has waited nearly 50 years to hear. When investigators looked back over the Linda O'Keefe case after the DNA breakthrough, one fact stood above every other. The investigation had never truly stopped. Public attention had faded. Headlines had disappeared. Detectives had retired. But somewhere inside evidence lockers, laboratory files, and carefully archived reports, The search for Linda's killer had continued without interruption. The case had survived because countless people, many of whom never met one another, believed that unanswered questions deserved another chance. Cold cases are often misunderstood. From the outside, they appear frozen in time. In reality, they evolve. Each scientific discovery changes the questions investigators are able to ask. Each technological advancement allows evidence to be examined from a new perspective. The Linda O'Keefe investigation demonstrated this evolution better than almost any case in California. In 1973, detectives asked witnesses what they had seen. By the 1990s, they asked laboratories what DNA could reveal. By the 2010s, they asked whether genealogy could identify relatives of an unknown offender. The evidence remained the same. Only the questions changed. That transformation became one of the defining lessons of the investigation. During interviews following the case's breakthrough, experienced detectives often reflected on the importance of persistence rather than luck. People sometimes described the DNA match as a miracle. Investigators viewed it differently. Science did not accidentally solve the case. The breakthrough became possible because evidence had been collected properly, preserved carefully, documented consistently, and re-examined whenever technology advanced. Luck may create opportunities. Professionalism determines whether those opportunities can be used. The original investigators could not know DNA would someday identify the offender. They simply understood that evidence should never be discarded if there remained even the smallest possibility it might matter in the future. That philosophy ultimately changed everything. The case also highlighted another reality familiar to homicide detectives: that justice rarely follows a straight path. For decades, investigators pursued countless leads that ultimately proved unrelated. Witnesses sincerely believed they had important information. Anonymous callers accused innocent people. Potential suspects were investigated and eliminated. Each dead end consumed valuable time and resources. From today's perspective, those efforts might appear unsuccessful. They were not. Every eliminated suspect narrowed the investigation. Every verified fact strengthened the integrity of the final case. Knowing who did not commit a crime can be nearly as important as discovering who did. As prosecutors continued preparing their case, forensic specialists carefully documented every scientific procedure involved in identifying James Allen Neal. The genealogy process received particular attention because it represented a relatively new investigative method. Experts emphasized a crucial distinction. Genetic genealogy did not establish criminal guilt. It generated investigative leads. The legal evidence came from the direct DNA comparison between Neal's sample and the biological evidence preserved from the crime scene. That distinction preserved the integrity of the investigation. Genealogy opened the door. Traditional forensic science confirmed who had walked through it. Legal scholars closely followed the case because it reflected the changing relationship between technology and criminal justice. Scientific progress often develops more rapidly than legal systems adapt. Cortez therefore play an essential role in evaluating new investigative methods while protecting established legal standards. The Linda O'Keefe investigation became part of that broader conversation. And not because it abandoned traditional principles, because it demonstrated how new technology could operate within them. Evidence still required authentication. Scientific procedures still required validation. Suspects still retained legal rights. The pursuit of justice remained governed by the same constitutional protections that existed long before DNA analysis became possible. For the broader public, however, the investigation carried a far more personal message. Many people remembered exactly where they were when they first learned Linda had disappeared in July 1973. Others were too young to remember the original crime, but followed the breakthrough decades later. Together, both generations witnessed something remarkable. A mystery that had once seemed permanent had finally reached an answer. That realization reshaped public confidence in cold case investigations. Families connected to other unsolved crimes found renewed hope. Organizations supporting victims encouraged law enforcement agencies to review preserved biological evidence. Cold case units across the country experienced increased public interest. The message spreading through the criminal justice community was clear. Age alone should never determine whether a homicide investigation deserves attention. As long as evidence survives, possibility survives. Within Orange County, investigators also reflected on how dramatically their profession had changed over the course of the case. The detectives who first responded in 1973 communicated through radios and paper reports. The detectives solving the case decades later relied upon advanced forensic laboratories, digital databases, and specialized genealogical researchers. Despite those differences, one essential principle had remained unchanged. Listen to the evidence. Avoid assumptions. And follow verified facts wherever they led. Technology may change investigative methods. It cannot replace disciplined detective work. That truth appeared repeatedly throughout the Linda O'Keefe investigation. Every scientific advance required careful interpretation. Every laboratory result required investigative context. Every lead required verification. As science did not eliminate detective work, it expanded what detectives were capable of accomplishing. The investigation also reminded law enforcement agencies of the value of institutional memory. Cold cases often survive because experienced investigators carefully document not only what they know, but how they know it. Yet future detectives inherit far more than evidence. They inherit reasoning, hypotheses, eliminated suspects, investigative strategies, questions that remain unanswered. The Linda O'Keefe file represented nearly 50 years of accumulated professional knowledge. Each detective contributed another chapter. None could complete the story alone. Public discussions surrounding the case frequently returned to Linda herself. It was easy to become fascinated by DNA technology, by genealogy, and by decades of investigative persistence. Yet investigators consistently reminded audiences that the true focus remained an 11-year-old girl whose life ended far too soon. The purpose of every scientific breakthrough was not technological achievement. It was accountability. Every advance in forensic science ultimately serves the same objective: giving victims a voice when they can no longer speak for themselves. As forensic experts lectured at conferences after the breakthrough, Linda's case became a powerful teaching example. Students learned about evidence preservation, crime scene documentation, chain of custody, DNA profiling, genetic genealogy, interagency cooperation. Each component illustrated how solving complex investigations often depends upon cumulative excellence rather than dramatic moments. There was no single instant when the mystery disappeared. Instead, thousands of careful decisions made across decades gradually removed uncertainty until only one conclusion remained consistent with all the evidence. That process reflected the highest ideals of criminal investigation: patience over haste, evidence over speculation, verification over assumption. Looking across nearly 5 decades, the investigation appeared almost impossible in scope. A child disappeared on a quiet summer afternoon. A community searched desperately for answers. Generations of detectives refused to surrender. Scientists transformed the possibilities of forensic analysis. Evidence silently preserved the truth through changing decades. Eventually, those separate threads converged into one investigation capable of answering a question that had haunted Orange County since 1973. The story of Linda O'Keefe therefore became more than a solved homicide. It became a testament to the extraordinary distance that justice can travel when people refuse to abandon it. Years may pass. Technology may change. Entire generations may come and go. But when evidence is preserved with care and pursued with unwavering determination, the truth possesses a remarkable ability to endure, waiting quietly through the passing decades until the day someone finally uncovers the story it has been carrying all along. By the time the Linda O'Keefe investigation became recognized as one of California's most significant cold case breakthroughs, its impact extended far beyond Orange County. What had begun as a heartbreaking child murder in the summer of 1973 had evolved into a landmark example of how perseverance, evidence preservation, and scientific innovation could converge across generations. Yet for the detectives who had carried the case through decades of uncertainty, the greatest lesson was not about technology alone. It was about the responsibility to never allow time to become an excuse for abandoning the search for truth. Cold cases occupy a unique place within criminal investigations. Unlike active cases, they unfold across decades rather than days. The detectives who begin them are rarely the ones who finish them. Each generation inherits unanswered questions from the last. Every transfer of responsibility becomes an act of trust. One investigator believes another, years later, may discover what they could not. The Linda O'Keefe investigation embodied that principle with remarkable clarity. The original detectives processed the crime scene without the benefit of DNA science. The next generation introduced forensic biology. Another embraced computerized investigative systems. Still another applied forensic genetic genealogy. Each advancement depended upon the careful work completed by those who came before. Without that continuity, the investigation would almost certainly have remained unsolved. This realization profoundly influenced homicide investigators across the country. Police departments began reevaluating evidence storage policies. Laboratories reviewed procedures for preserving biological material collected from violent crimes. Training academies emphasized meticulous documentation,